Picture this, a city engulfed in flame, its towering walls breached, the very heart of the world's first true empire, Ashur, collapsing into rubble and dust. It's a scene we're often taught to see as an ending, the final, dramatic defeat of a mighty power. But what if I told you that this moment, so often painted as a catastrophe, was actually one of history's most profound beginnings? What if the fall of Ashur wasn't a defeat at all, but the essential spark that ignited a new global order, reshaping civilization in ways that would echo for centuries? This is the incredible paradox we're going to explore together, a story not of an ending, but of a transformation so powerful it redefined the very concept of empire. We often view collapse through a lens of loss, but hidden within the ashes of Ashur lies a testament to human resilience, a blueprint for renewal that challenges everything we think we know about rise and fall. This journey will take us deep into the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, to a time when the world was being remade. We'll walk through the bustling streets of Ashur at its peak, feel the tension of its final siege, and then witness the astonishing aftermath, a period not of darkness, but of vibrant cultural exchange, economic reconfiguration, and political innovation. You'll discover how scribes, merchants, and artisans carried the legacy of Ashur far beyond its ruins, seeding new empires with ideas that would foster greater tolerance, connectivity, and stability. This isn't just a story about the past, it's a narrative about the cyclical nature of human progress, where breakdown can become a breakthrough, and where the end of one era is merely the prelude to the next. By the time we're done, you'll see these ancient events in a completely new light, and you might even find surprising parallels to our own world of rapid change, shifting alliances, and global challenges. The lessons from Ashur's fall are timeless. They speak to the power of adaptation, the importance of preserving knowledge, and the incredible potential that lies hidden within moments of crisis. So, if you're ready to uncover one of history's greatest untold stories, to see how a civilization's collapse planted the seeds for a new world, then let's begin this exploration into a pivotal moment that didn't just change the ancient world, it helped create the one we live in today. To truly grasp the scale of what came later, we need to journey back to the very beginning, to the dusty, sun-baked banks of the Tigris River, where a small settlement named for the god Ashur first took root. This was not a place blessed with vast, fertile fields or abundant natural resources. Its power didn't spring from the land, but from the minds and ambitions of its people. Ashur's location was its first and greatest masterstroke. Perched at a crucial crossroads, it became the vital link between the resource-rich highlands of Anatolia and the sophisticated city-states of southern Mesopotamia. Think of it as the central hub in an ancient, sprawling network where caravans laden with tin from the east, textiles from the south, and silver from the north would all converge. This wasn't just casual trade, it was the lifeblood of an emerging economic superpower. The city's merchants, organized into sophisticated family firms, established a web of trading colonies across the region, outposts like Qanat in modern-day Turkey. These weren't merely market stalls, they were fortified settlements with their own governance, acting as diplomatic and commercial embassies that extended Ashur's influence far beyond its walls, weaving a web of economic dependency that entire regions came to rely on. But a thriving economy needs protection and structure, and the Assyrians proved to be relentless innovators in both warfare and governance. Their military evolution was particularly formidable. They moved beyond the aristocratic chariot warfare of their neighbors to develop a highly disciplined professional army. This was a force built on standardized equipment, rigorous training, and combined arms tactics that integrated infantry, cavalry, and sophisticated siege engines. They were among the first to effectively use iron weapons on a massive scale, giving them a technological edge that would become a hallmark of their might. Yet, this military machine would have been useless without an administrative system to support it. The Assyrians developed a bureaucracy of astonishing efficiency for its time. Scribes trained in the complex cuneiform script kept meticulous records on clay tablets, inventories, tax rolls, troop movements, and legal decrees. This wasn't just paperwork, it was the central nervous system of the state, allowing for the coordination of campaigns, the redistribution of wealth, and the management of a growing, diverse population. This administrative genius meant that the empire could project power and maintain control over vast distances, a lesson later empires would study closely. The entire Assyrian worldview was underpinned by a powerful and unifying religious ideology centered on their patron deity, Ashur. Unlike other Mesopotamian gods who were tied to specific cities, Ashur was a national god, a divine emperor whose will was believed to drive Assyrian expansion. Kings ruled not merely as monarchs, but as Ashur's chief priests, their military campaigns framed as holy missions to impose divine order upon a chaotic world. This belief system provided a powerful justification for empire, uniting the people under a shared, sacred destiny. Victory in battle was proof of Ashur's favor, and defeat was a call to religious renewal. This fusion of faith and statecraft created a society with a relentless drive and a powerful sense of purpose. We can see this ambition fully realized in figures like King Shamshi Adad I in the 18th century before the Common Era. He didn't just rule a city, he crafted a kingdom, seizing control of rival centers and forging a territorial state that stretched across northern Mesopotamia. He established a centralized administration, directly appointing his sons as governors, and styled himself as King of the World. His reign was a blueprint, a powerful demonstration of what was possible when military might, administrative control, and ideological conviction were fused together. He showed that Ashur was not destined to remain just another city-state, but was capable of something far greater. In its relentless pursuit of trade, its refinement of military science, its bureaucratic innovations, and its unwavering faith, the rise of Ashur planted every seed of strength, of structure, and of ambition that would later, even in its moment of apparent destruction, allow its legacy to be reborn. The year is 614 before the Common Era, and the air over Ashur is heavy with the scent of burning cedar and fear. For weeks, the mighty walls have held against the combined armies of Babylon and Media, but now the end is imminent. Inside, the once bustling streets are choked with rubble, and the grand halls where kings once plotted the fate of empires now echo with the desperate shouts of defenders and the relentless crash of enemy battering rams. This was not a slow decline but a violent, concentrated assault on the very heart of the Assyrian state. The coalition, led by the ambitious Babylonian king Nabopolassar and the Median leader Cyrus, had learned from decades of Assyrian domination. They understood that to break the empire's spirit, they first had to shatter its symbolic core. The fall of the city was stunningly swift, a testament not just to the attacker's resolve but to a perfect storm of vulnerabilities that had been brewing within Ashur for years. To understand why this seemingly invincible fortress fell, we need to look beyond the siege itself. The Assyrian Empire, for all its military brilliance, was stretched perilously thin. Decades of constant warfare from the Levant to Egypt had drained its treasury and exhausted its manpower. Internally, the royal court was plagued by intrigue and succession crises, weakening the central authority at the very moment it needed to be strongest. The empire's very structure, which relied on the constant flow of tribute and taxes from conquered territories, began to fracture as those regions saw an opportunity to rebel. Externally, the rise of a unified and determined opposition was a new and devastating challenge. Nabopolassar, a former Assyrian governor himself, had masterfully stitched together an alliance of peoples who had all felt the sting of Assyrian aggression. The Medes from the Iranian plateau brought a new kind of mobile warfare and a deep-seated desire for retribution. This coalition wasn't just a random gathering of enemies. It was a calculated partnership forged in shared resentment, and it targeted Ashur with a strategic precision the empire itself had once mastered. The military tactics employed in the final assault were a brutal inversion of Assyria's own playbook. The Babylonians and Medes used sophisticated siege engines, likely learned or even captured from earlier encounters with the Assyrian army, to breach the formidable walls. They would have targeted the city's water sources and supply lines, creating a stranglehold that made resistance futile. The psychological warfare was equally devastating. The looting and destruction of the temples, particularly those dedicated to the national god Ashur, was a deliberate act of symbolic annihilation. For the Assyrians, their god was inseparable from their state. To see his sanctuaries desecrated was to witness the unraveling of their entire world order. Yet, amidst this calculated destruction, a crucial event unfolded that would preserve Ashur's legacy. The royal archives, vast libraries of clay tablets containing everything from administrative records and legal codes to literary texts and scientific observations, were not entirely destroyed. While many were looted or smashed, a significant number were carried away by the conquerors or remained buried in the ruins, waiting for archaeologists millennia later. This reveals a fascinating duality in the conquerors' motives. While they sought to erase Assyrian political power, they also recognized the immense value of its knowledge. Nabopolassar and his allies were not mere vandals. They were the founders of new states, and they understood that the administrative, legal, and scientific advances contained in those archives were tools for building their own empires. The capture of Ashur was as much about seizing a template for power as it was about achieving a military victory. So, what does this moment of catastrophic collapse truly reveal? It shows us that the fall of an empire is rarely a simple on-off switch. It is a transfer of energy. The physical structures of Ashur were broken, but its intellectual and administrative frameworks, its very operating system, was harvested. The chaos of the siege and the smoldering ruins did not mark an end, but a violent, necessary dispersal. The seeds of Assyrian genius, scattered by the very storm that seemed to destroy them, were now carried on the wind, ready to take root in the fertile ground of new ambitions. But what happened to the people when the fighting stopped and the fires died down? They did not simply disappear into the history books. Instead, a remarkable and often overlooked migration began. Think of it not as a retreat, but as a great scattering of seeds. Assyrian scribes, their minds filled with the intricacies of law and administration, found employment in the chancelleries of Babylon. Artisans who had once carved magnificent Lamassu to guard the palaces of Nineveh now offered their skills to new patrons. Traders, with their deep understanding of routes and exchange rates, re-established their networks under different flags. This was a forced diaspora, a direct result of the political collapse, but it became the primary vehicle for a silent cultural revolution. The expert Karen Radner beautifully illustrates this point, showing that the true legacy of Ashur was not in its standing armies, but in the portable, intellectual capital carried by its people. They brought with them the entire operating system of an empire, the legal codes that governed commerce and property, the architectural techniques for raising monumental cities, and the religious rituals that connected humanity to the divine. This knowledge didn't remain in a pure, isolated form. It was offered up, blended, and adapted, becoming a vital ingredient in the cultural DNA of the rising powers. One of the most profound and lasting changes was the explosive spread of the Aramaic language. Even before the fall, Aramaic had been growing in popularity due to its simple, alphabetic script, a much more accessible system than the complex cuneiform used for official Assyrian records. The empire's own bureaucracy had begun using both. After the collapse, with Assyrian elites dispersed and their administrative centers gone, Aramaic truly came into its own. It became the common tongue of trade, diplomacy, and everyday life across the entire Near East, from the borders of Egypt to the heart of Persia. Imagine a merchant in Damascus, a tax official in Babylon, and a caravan master from Persia, all being able to communicate using the same language. This shared linguistic platform drastically reduced friction. It allowed for clearer contracts, smoother negotiations, and the more efficient movement of ideas. The old world, dominated by a single imperial power enforcing its will, was giving way to a new, more interconnected world where communication could flow more freely across cultures. The fall of the central authority, paradoxically, helped create a more unified cultural sphere through this shared language. This blending is stunningly visible in the art and architecture that emerged in the centuries that followed. Look at the grand palaces of the Persian Empire at Persepolis. The very scale and concept of a monumental royal complex are deeply Assyrian, but the style is something new. The towering stone columns and their intricate capitals are distinctly Persian, yet the sprawling reliefs that adorn the walls tell a familiar story. They depict processions of tribute bearers and court ceremonies, a theme straight out of the Assyrian playbook for projecting power, but the execution is different. The brutal, hyper-muscular realism of Assyrian art, designed to inspire fear and awe, softens into a more serene, elegant, and almost ceremonial style in Persia. The conquerors were not just knocking down the old statues, they were studying them, learning what worked, and then refining the message to suit their own, often more inclusive, ideology. It was a creative fusion where Assyrian grandeur met Persian sophistication to produce an artistic language fit for a new kind of multi-ethnic empire. Even the core ideology of what an empire should be underwent a radical transformation, directly informed by the lessons of Assyria's harsh collapse. The Assyrian model was one of top-down, centralized control, often maintained through sheer military terror and the brutal suppression of revolt. The successor states, particularly the Persians, looked at this model and saw its fatal flaw. It created immense resentment and was incredibly brittle. When the center could no longer project overwhelming force, the entire structure shattered. So they innovated. The Persian Achaemenid Empire developed a more federated model. They divided their vast territories into provinces or satrapies, each governed by a local official who answered to the king. But here was the genius part. These satraps were often allowed to maintain local customs, laws, and even religions. The famous Cyrus cylinder, often called the first charter of human rights, boasts of returning displaced peoples to their homelands and restoring their gods to their temples. This was a complete ideological shift. Empire was no longer just about extraction and domination. It was about integration and management. The goal was to create stability through a degree of local autonomy, a concept that can be traced directly back to the Persian observation of what had caused the Assyrian system to fail so catastrophically. Perhaps the most poignant example of this intellectual transfer is the story of the Great Library of Ashurbanipal. This was not merely a collection of books, It was the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, a conscious effort by the last great Assyrian king to gather all the significant texts of Mesopotamian civilization under one roof. When Nineveh fell, this library was sacked and burned, but clay tablets have a funny way of surviving fires that would destroy paper. While the building was ruined, the knowledge was not lost. Many of these tablets, containing everything from the Epic of Gilgamesh to advanced medical diagnoses and precise astronomical observations, were carried off as spoils of war. They found new homes in Babylonian and later Persian libraries. Babylonian astronomers, building directly upon the meticulous star charts and celestial omens compiled by their Assyrian predecessors, would achieve remarkable levels of accuracy. This preserved knowledge would, centuries later, become a foundation for Greek science, creating an unbroken, though often forgotten, chain of intellectual inheritance. The fall of Ashur, therefore, did not extinguish its light. It took that flame and, through the winds of diaspora, spread it across the ancient world, allowing it to burn brighter and longer in new hearts. This hidden renaissance, born from the ashes of defeat, proves that the most enduring conquests are not always achieved by armies, but by the quiet, persistent power of ideas. So, with the old Assyrian monopolies shattered, the economic map of the ancient world was effectively redrawn, not with a single imperial capital at its center, but with a vibrant, multipolar network of trade hubs buzzing with new energy. This wasn't a story of economic depression following collapse. It was one of liberation and diversification. The rigid, tributary system that had funneled wealth directly to Nineveh was gone, and in its place emerged a more organic, market-driven economy where a multitude of players could now thrive. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, inheriting the fertile heartlands of Mesopotamia, quickly positioned itself as a new commercial titan. Under kings like Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon wasn't just rebuilt as a city of breathtaking architectural wonders, it was re-engineered as an economic powerhouse. The city became the central clearinghouse for goods flowing from the Persian Gulf, the Levant, and Anatolia. Its policies actively encouraged this flow. The state invested heavily in infrastructure, maintaining and expanding the intricate network of canals that served as the region's highways, facilitating the cheap and efficient movement of grain, dates, and textiles. They also implemented a degree of standardization, promoting consistent weights and measures that built trust and reduced friction between merchants from different cultures. This created a stable and predictable environment where commerce could flourish, attracting traders from across the known world to its bustling markets. No one exemplifies this new era of opportunity better than the Phoenician city-states, particularly Tyre and Sidon. For centuries, they had operated under the shadow of Assyrian power, often forced to pay heavy tribute. With that pressure removed, they experienced a commercial golden age. The Phoenicians were the master mariners of the ancient world, and they now had the freedom to fully unleash their maritime prowess. They didn't just fill the vacuum, they expanded it, pushing their trade routes further than ever before. From their famous workshops came the vibrant purple dyes and exquisite glassware that were coveted across the Mediterranean. But more importantly, they became the essential middlemen, connecting the resource-rich worlds of Mesopotamia and Egypt with the emerging markets of the Aegean and North Africa. Their most profound legacy was the establishment of permanent trading colonies, with Carthage in North Africa being the most famous. These weren't just temporary outposts, they were full-fledged cities that replicated Phoenician culture and commercial practices, creating a vast, interconnected web of trade that was no longer dependent on any single land-based empire. This maritime expansion fundamentally altered the economic gravity of the region, shifting significant wealth and influence toward the Mediterranean coast. On the ground, the nature of commerce itself was evolving. The old Assyrian model relied heavily on state-controlled enterprises and royal monopolies on certain goods. In the post-Ashur landscape, we see the rising influence of more independent merchant guilds and family firms. These were associations of traders who pooled resources, shared risks, and established codes of conduct. They could finance larger caravans, insure against losses through informal agreements, and leverage their collective influence to negotiate better terms in foreign ports. This decentralized model proved incredibly resilient. If one route was blocked by conflict or a particular city fell into disfavor, these networks could quickly adapt and redirect their goods through another pathway. This flexibility was the antithesis of the brittle, centralized Assyrian system. Furthermore, the increased use of silver as a common medium of exchange, moving beyond simple barter, accelerated this growth. While coinage as we know it was still in its infancy, the standardized weighing of silver shekels in transactions became widespread, simplifying trade across linguistic and cultural barriers and allowing for a more sophisticated economy of credit and deferred payment to develop. The ultimate beneficiaries of this great economic reconfiguration were the rising Persian dynasties. By the time Cyrus the Great began his meteoric ascent, the groundwork for his empire's economic miracle had already been laid. He inherited a world where trade routes were already established, commercial practices were standardized, and a culture of long-distance exchange was thriving. The Persian genius lay in recognizing, protecting, and enhancing this system. They didn't smash it and start over, they integrated it. The famous Royal Road, a masterpiece of logistics stretching over 1,600 miles from Sardis to Susa, was the ultimate expression of this. It wasn't built entirely from scratch. It often linked pre-existing trade paths into a single, state-protected highway. Couriers on horseback could traverse its length in a matter of days, relaying administrative orders, but more importantly, it provided a safe, reliable corridor for merchants and their caravans. The Persians enforced a pax persica, a Persian peace across their vast dominions, suppressing banditry and reducing interstate conflicts that had previously plagued traders. This dramatic reduction in risk was perhaps the most significant economic policy of all. By investing in security and infrastructure, the state effectively subsidized commerce, leading to an unprecedented movement of goods, people, and ideas from the Indus Valley to the Nile. The economic resilience born from the chaos of Ashur's fall ultimately provided the fuel for the next great imperial engine, proving that the most enduring prosperity is often built not on control, but on connection. With the old economic order shattered and new trade routes buzzing, the political landscape of the ancient Near East was ripe for a dramatic reshuffling. The collapse of Ashur didn't create an empty space for long. It created an opportunity, a power vacuum that was quickly filled by ambitious new players who understood that to build something lasting, they couldn't just conquer, they had to learn. The first to truly seize this moment were the Neo-Babylonians. Under the shrewd leadership of King Nabopolassar and his legendary son, Nebuchadnezzar II, they didn't merely rebuild Babylon, they reimagined it as the glittering capital of a new world. Their empire was a testament to ambition, a state that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Yet, for all its splendor, the Neo-Babylonian realm often operated with a familiar heavy hand, its grip maintained through military campaigns and the forced relocation of populations, as famously depicted in the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. It was a powerful but in many ways a traditional empire, still wrestling with the old model of control through intimidation. The true revolution in governance, the birth of a genuinely new world order, came from an unexpected quarter, the highlands of Iran with the rise of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. This was not just another kingdom replacing the last. Under the visionary leadership of Cyrus the Great, the Persians engineered a political system of breathtaking scale and sophistication. They looked at the Assyrian Empire and saw its brilliance, its provincial systems, its road networks, its bureaucratic record-keeping, but they also diagnosed its fatal flaw, a reliance on raw terror that bred deep-seated resentment and made the empire brittle. The Persian innovation was to build upon the Assyrian administrative skeleton, but clothe it in a new ideology of tolerance and integration. As the scholar Pierre Bryant has extensively documented, Cyrus and his successors were masterful adapters. They took the Assyrian model of dividing territory into provinces, but transformed the local governor or satrap from a mere extractive agent of the king into a manager of a semi-autonomous region. These satraps were often drawn from local elites, people who understood the customs and languages of their own people. This was a profound shift. It was the difference between a colonial master and a regional administrator. This new approach is perfectly crystallized in one of the most famous artifacts from the ancient world, the Cyrus cylinder. Discovered in the ruins of Babylon, this clay document is often hailed as an early charter of human rights. In it, Cyrus announces his victory not as a brutal subjugation, but as a liberation. He boasts of restoring deported peoples to their homelands and of returning plundered cult statues to their temples, allowing them to worship their own gods once more. This was brilliant statecraft disguised as piety, where the Assyrians sought to break local spirits by erasing cultural identity. The Persians sought to win hearts and minds by affirming it. They understood that a person who could pray to their own god and live under their own customary laws was far less likely to rebel. This policy of calculated tolerance created a powerful sense of buy-in from the diverse populations within the empire, from the Jews in Judah to the Greeks in Ionia. It was a pragmatic recognition that a vast, multi-ethnic empire could not be held together by force alone. It required a measure of consent. The physical backbone of this new, more connected political order was the incredible infrastructure the Persians inherited and expanded, most notably the royal road. This was not merely a path for armies, but the information superhighway of its day. Stretching over 1,600 miles, it featured way stations with fresh horses and secure lodgings, allowing royal messengers to traverse the empire in a matter of days. This system, inspired by Assyrian predecessors but built on a grander scale, allowed the central authority in capitals like Persepolis and Susa to maintain a surprising degree of control over its distant satrapies. Decrees could be transmitted, taxes could be accounted for, and intelligence on potential unrest could flow back to the center with unprecedented speed. This logistical network enabled the Pax Persica, the Persian peace, which suppressed local conflicts and banditry, creating a stable environment where commerce and culture could flourish across continents. The political realignment after Ashur's fall, therefore, was not about starting from scratch. It was about taking the best tools of the old empire, its administrative structures and its ambition for unity, and welding them to a new, more resilient philosophy of power, one built on inclusion and integration rather than sheer domination. This fusion created a political model so effective that it would influence every empire that followed, from Rome to the caliphates, proving that the most enduring legacies are not those imposed by the sword, but those built with the wisdom to adapt and include. While the political landscape was being reshaped by new empires, the physical world those empires inhabited was still fundamentally an Assyrian one, rebuilt and refined. The true measure of Ashur's genius wasn't in the palaces that were toppled, but in the invisible frameworks of technology and infrastructure that refused to die. Think of it this way: an empire can be decapitated, its leaders replaced, and its armies disbanded, but you cannot uninvent a well, a road, or a revolutionary way of building a wall. These were the tools that had enabled Assyrian dominance, and in the hands of their successors, they became the very instruments for building a new, more interconnected world. The fall of Ashur didn't halt progress, it democratized it. Suddenly, the closely guarded state secrets of Assyrian engineers were up for grabs, studied and improved upon by Babylonian planners, Median metalworkers, and Persian architects. This was a technological diaspora, a silent transfer of knowledge that accelerated innovation across the board. One of the most critical and life-sustaining legacies was in water management. The Assyrians had been masters of hydrology, constructing elaborate canal systems and using sophisticated aqueducts, like the one at Jerwan built by King Sennacherib, which carried water across valleys on massive stone arches. This expertise didn't vanish, it traveled. The Persians, in particular, encountered the challenge of settling the arid Iranian plateau, and they found their solution in an Assyrian-inspired technology, the Qanat. This was a brilliantly simple yet labor-intensive system for tapping underground water in foothills and transporting it across vast distances to arid plains. A mother well was dug deep into the water table at the base of a mountain. Then, a series of vertical shafts were dug in a straight line towards the destination, connected at the bottom by a gently sloping tunnel. This allowed gravity to do all the work, bringing a constant, reliable flow of water to the surface without a single pump, while the vertical shafts provided ventilation and access for maintenance. The Persians didn't just copy this, they perfected it, constructing vast networks of qanats that turned barren landscapes into flourishing agricultural centers, supporting new cities and fueling the Persian Empire's growth. This was a direct technological inheritance that literally made life possible in new regions, a clear case where Assyrian ingenuity, once used to supply their own imperial cities, was now enabling the expansion of their successors. On the move, the very paths that connected this new world were also an Assyrian bequest. The concept of a state-maintained, long-distance road network was an Assyrian innovation. They built royal roads to move their armies with terrifying speed, complete with way stations and official rest stops. The Persian Empire looked at this system and saw its potential not just for war but for peace and governance. They expanded it exponentially, creating the famous Royal Road, a monumental achievement in logistics. This wasn't just a dirt path, it was a carefully managed highway with inns, guard posts, and regular courier stations where riders could swap tired horses for fresh ones, allowing a message to travel from Sardis to Susa, a distance of over 1,600 miles in just a week. This infrastructure was the circulatory system of the empire, and its Assyrian DNA was unmistakable. It meant that trade goods, administrative decrees, and even cultural ideas could flow with a speed and security that was previously unimaginable, binding the diverse satrapies of the Persian Empire into a cohesive whole. Even the tools of war, the very means by which Ashur had been destroyed, carried its imprint. The Assyrian military was a marvel of engineering, pioneering the large-scale use of iron weaponry, developing more powerful and mobile siege towers, and refining the design of chariots to make them faster and more lethal on the battlefield. The armies that besieged Nineveh had learned these lessons well. The Medes and Babylonians incorporated these advanced siege techniques into their own arsenals. Later, the Persian army would become the ultimate beneficiary, fielding a diverse and technologically advanced force that used Assyrian-style tactics and equipment. The iconic Persian Superpower formation, with its wall of wicker shields and long spears, was an evolution of earlier infantry tactics. Their use of specialized units, cavalry, archers, and engineers, reflected a sophisticated understanding of combined arms warfare that the Assyrians had pioneered. The conquerors had to become students of the very empire they overthrew, adopting and adapting its military technology to build their own powerful armies. This transfer ensured that the art of warfare continued to evolve, with each successive empire standing on the shoulders of the Assyrian giants they had defeated. Perhaps the most symbolic fusion of all can be imagined in one of the ancient world's lost wonders, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. While their exact location and existence are still debated by historians, many theories suggest that if they did exist, they were a masterpiece of engineering that likely drew upon Assyrian horticultural and hydraulic expertise. The concept of a towering, terraced garden with its complex irrigation system needed to lift water to great heights is exactly the kind of project an Assyrian engineer would have been trained for. King Sennacherib himself boasted of creating a magnificent garden at Nineveh, complete with water-raising screws and elaborate canals. It is perfectly plausible that when the Neo-Babylonian kings wanted to create a wonder to proclaim their own glory, they turned to the captured knowledge of the very people they had conquered. The gardens would have stood as a breathtaking monument to this technological continuity, a Babylonian achievement built with an Assyrian toolbox, symbolizing how the old and new could blend to create something truly magnificent. This enduring legacy of innovation, from the water flowing in the Qanat to the stones of the royal road, reveals a profound truth about human civilization: knowledge is tenacious. It outlives kings, survives the fall of empires, and becomes the fertile ground from which every new world order must inevitably grow. Now, consider the intricate machinery that held these vast empires together, not the armies in the field, but the quiet, relentless work of scribes and administrators in dusty offices. The true, unsung revolution born from Ashur's fall was in the realm of bureaucracy itself. The Assyrians had perfected a system of hierarchical governance so effective that their conquerors didn't just loot its gold, they plundered its organizational charts. The Persian Empire, in particular, looked at the complex Assyrian provincial system and saw a brilliant starting point, but they were astute enough to recognize its critical weakness: a rigid, top-down approach that crushed local identity and bred resentment. So they performed a masterstroke of administrative engineering. They adopted the framework of provinces, but transformed them into satrapies, each governed by a satrap, or protector of the kingdom. The genius, as historian Amélie Couot highlights, was in the adaptation. Where the Assyrians often installed their own governors to rule with an iron fist, the Persians frequently appointed local elites, native princes or respected nobles, to the role of satrap. This was a profound shift from direct rule to a form of federal management. The satrap collected taxes, raised troops, and maintained order, but he did so while largely respecting the local customs, laws, and even religions of his people. This policy of calculated tolerance turned potential rebels into stakeholders. A person in Lydia or Egypt might be paying taxes to a distant Persian king, but if they could still worship their own gods and be judged by their own traditional laws, the weight of foreign rule felt significantly lighter. This administrative flexibility became the secret glue of the Persian Empire, creating a cohesive whole out of incredibly diverse parts without needing to constantly resort to the sword. The lifeblood of this sprawling administrative body was communication, and here the Assyrian legacy flowed through the elegant script of the Aramaic language. Even before their empire fell, the Assyrians had begun using Aramaic alongside their own complex cuneiform for official business. Its simple, alphabetic script was far easier to learn and write than the hundreds of intricate cuneiform signs, making it the perfect tool for a fast-moving bureaucracy. After the collapse, Aramaic exploded in usage, becoming the administrative lingua franca from the borders of India to the shores of the Mediterranean. Imagine a tax report being written in Babylon, a royal decree issued from Persepolis, and a legal contract sealed in Jerusalem, all using the same accessible language. This was a revolutionary development. It meant that an empire of 100 different tongues could be managed with a single, standardized written language. Scribes trained in Aramaic became some of the most valuable civil servants, their pens ensuring that the will of the central government could be understood and implemented uniformly across thousands of miles. This linguistic unification drastically reduced errors, sped up administrative processes, and fostered a shared bureaucratic culture that transcended ethnic and cultural divisions. The fall of Ashur had, in a roundabout way, helped create a common administrative tongue that made the next empire not only larger but more manageable. To keep this vast system honest and informed, the Persians inherited and supercharged another Assyrian invention, the Royal Intelligence Network. The Assyrian kings had relied on networks of informers and swift messengers to sniff out rebellion and deliver urgent commands. The Persians institutionalized this on an unprecedented scale. Their network of royal inspectors, known as the king's eyes or the king's ears, traveled the empire without warning. These officials reported directly to the king, bypassing the local satraps entirely, and had the authority to investigate corruption, audit accounts, and ensure that royal policy was being followed. This created a powerful system of checks and balances. A satrap in a distant province knew that at any moment, an unannounced inspector from the central court could arrive to scrutinize his records and interview his subjects. This constant, invisible oversight was a powerful deterrent against abuse of power and secessionist ambitions. It meant that the central authority, though far away, always had a long reach. This system of accountability, built on an Assyrian model of control but refined for a more complex empire, was crucial for maintaining stability and preventing the vast satrapies from spinning off into independent kingdoms. The impact of these administrative reforms on the daily life of an ordinary person, a farmer, a potter, or a merchant, was tangible and often positive. Under the heavy-handed Assyrian system, a bad harvest could mean ruin, as tax collectors demanded their fixed quota regardless of local conditions. The Persian system, while still demanding, often showed more flexibility. Detailed records allowed for a more nuanced understanding of a province's capacity. In times of drought or blight, a satrap could petition the king for a temporary tax reduction to prevent widespread famine and social collapse. Furthermore, the Persian peace and the state-maintained road networks meant that farmers could get their surplus goods to market more safely and efficiently, and merchants could travel with a greater expectation of security. The standardized weights and measures enforced by the administration reduced cheating in the marketplace, building trust in commercial transactions. For the common person, good administration wasn't an abstract concept. It meant predictable taxes, safer roads, and fairer markets. It meant that the vast, impersonal machinery of empire could, at its best, create a stable environment where communities could thrive, trade could flourish, and daily life was not constantly overshadowed by the threat of arbitrary violence or economic chaos. This was the ultimate testament to the success of the adapted Assyrian model. It built an empire that, for a time, worked not just for the rulers but for the millions of people who lived within it. Yet, even as the stones of Ashur's temples cooled, the gods of the fallen empire refused to die. They simply packed their bags and moved in with the neighbors. This was not a story of one religion conquering another, but of a fascinating, complex merger. a spiritual syncretism where the divine identities of conquerors and the conquered began to blur and blend. The national god Ashur, once the unchallenged celestial emperor whose will justified Assyrian expansion, could not simply be erased. In the victorious Babylonian culture, a remarkable theological absorption took place. The Babylonian supreme god Marduk began to take on the attributes and even the iconography of Ashur. It was as if the new rulers understood that to truly claim the land and its people, they had to also claim its divine protector, folding his power into their own existing pantheon to create a more potent universal deity. This was a pragmatic and profound spiritual strategy. By merging Marduk and Ashur, the Babylonians were not just appeasing a conquered population, they were crafting a new divine mandate for their own rule, one that could appeal to both their own citizens and their new Assyrian subjects. The message was subtle but clear. The god of this land has not been defeated. He has simply chosen a new favorite people and a new name. This spiritual fusion reached its most sophisticated expression with the rise of the Persian Empire and its state religion, Zoroastrianism. On the surface, the faith preached by the prophet Zoroaster was a radical departure from the crowded Mesopotamian pantheons. It presented a cosmic dualism, a struggle between a supreme god of light and wisdom, Ahura Mazda, and a destructive spirit of falsehood and chaos, Angra Mainyu. Yet, when this new faith encountered the ancient beliefs of Mesopotamia, it did not simply replace them. Instead, it engaged in a deep dialogue. Zoroastrianism absorbed core elements of the older cosmology. The Mesopotamian preoccupation with celestial omens and the belief that the movements of stars and planets reflected divine will found a new home in Persian astrology. The complex hierarchy of lesser divinities, the Yazotas who served Ahura Mazda, bore a functional resemblance to the lesser gods in the Assyrian and Babylonian systems, acting as intermediaries for specific domains like water, earth, or fire. This was not a wholesale takeover but a creative reinterpretation, where the new faith provided a fresh philosophical framework for ancient, enduring spiritual concepts. The Persians were building a universal empire, and their religion evolved to match, becoming a system capable of incorporating and recontextualizing the gods of the people they ruled. The physical spaces of worship told this story of transformation in stone and brick. The great temples of Ashur and Nineveh were not all left as hollow ruins. Many were systematically repurposed by their new owners. A temple once dedicated to Ashur might be rededicated to Marduk or, in Persian territories, converted into a fire temple for the worship of Ahura Mazda. The priesthoods, the keepers of ritual knowledge, faced a choice: fade away or adapt. Many chose the latter. Assyrian priests, with their deep understanding of the ritual calendar, sacrificial rites, and the art of divination, found employment within the new religious establishments. Their expertise was too valuable to lose. They became the translators of the old ways into the new order, ensuring that the rhythm of religious life, the festivals, the prayers for a good harvest, the rites for protecting the city continued, even if the name of the god being invoked had changed. This continuity in personnel and practice provided a crucial thread of stability for ordinary people, making the monumental political and religious shifts happening above them feel less disruptive in their daily lives. No single artifact captures this blending of political pragmatism and religious innovation better than the Cyrus cylinder. When the Persian king Cyrus the Great entered Babylon in 539 before the Common Era, he issued this proclamation on a clay cylinder. To the modern eye, it might look like a simple piece of political propaganda, and it is, but it is also a profound theological document. In it, Cyrus does not boast of smashing the idols of the Babylonian god Marduk. Instead, he claims that Marduk himself chose him, Cyrus, as the rightful ruler of Babylon. He portrays himself as the god's instrument, tasked with correcting the impiety of the previous Babylonian king and restoring the proper cult of Marduk, even returning deported peoples and their gods to their home cities. This was a masterstroke. It was a declaration of religious tolerance, yes, but it was also a savvy act of theological syncretism. Cyrus was speaking the religious language of Mesopotamia to legitimize his rule, seamlessly weaving his own Persian identity as a follower of Ahura Mazda into the existing Babylonian divine narrative. He was presenting a new model of kingship where the ruler was not the sole devotee of a single national god, but a protector of many gods and many peoples, united under his just and divinely sanctioned rule. This great spiritual melting pot inevitably stirred new ways of thinking about the divine itself. The constant interaction between the complex polytheism of Mesopotamia and the more dualistic, universalizing tendencies of Zoroastrianism created fertile ground for a revolutionary idea, monotheism. The Zoroastrian concept of a single supreme creator, Ahura Mazda, who was engaged in a cosmic struggle for the soul of the world, was a radical simplification of the divine landscape. This idea, circulating through the trade routes and administrative centers of the Persian Empire, profoundly influenced the exiled Jewish community in Babylon. Jewish prophets of this period, such as 2nd Isaiah, began to articulate a vision of their God, Yahweh, that was strikingly universal and absolute, a God who was not just the God of Israel, but the one true God of all creation, a ruler of history who could anoint a pagan Persian king like Cyrus as his Messiah. This was a dramatic evolution from the earlier, more tribal conception of Yahweh, and it is almost impossible to imagine without the cross-cultural religious ferment that followed Assyria's fall. The collapse of a dominant, particularist religious system opened up intellectual space for these more universalist beliefs to take root and flourish, ultimately shaping the course of Western religious history. But the most visible and breathtaking evidence of this cultural transformation wasn't just in the minds of administrators or the tongues of traders. It was carved in stone, baked into brick, and woven into fabric, transforming the very visual landscape of the ancient world. As the political structures of Ashur crumbled, its artists and master craftsmen found themselves at a crossroads. Their royal patrons were gone, but their unparalleled skills were a form of currency more valuable than gold in the new kingdoms rising from the ashes. These artisans did not simply vanish. They migrated, taking their centuries-honed techniques and distinctive visual language with them into the workshops of Babylon and the grand construction sites of the nascent Persian Empire. This diaspora of creativity did not result in mere copies of Assyrian art. It sparked a brilliant generative fusion. The rigid, awe-inspiring style of the Assyrian court, designed to project an image of unchallengeable power, began to meld with the more fluid, elegant sensibilities of Babylonian art and the ceremonial grandeur favored by the Persians. What emerged was a new, composite artistic language, one that could speak to multiple cultures at once, celebrating the power of new rulers while acknowledging the deep, sophisticated roots of the civilizations they now governed. We can witness this dialogue most vividly in the evolution of one of the most iconic symbols of Mesopotamian power, the Lamassu. In the great palaces of Nineveh and Khorsabad, these colossal, winged human-headed bulls and lions stood as terrifying guardians. They were creatures of immense muscular power, carved with a hyper-realistic attention to detail in the veins of their legs and the feathers of their wings. Their purpose was psychological domination. They were the first and last thing a foreign envoy or supplicant would see, a stone embodiment of the empire's overwhelming force. When the Persians began building their own ceremonial capital at Persepolis, They adopted the Lamassu, but they fundamentally reinterpreted it. The Persian Lamassu, while still monumental, feels different. Its form is more streamlined, more graceful. The fierce, watchful expression of the Assyrian version softens into a serene, almost benevolent gaze. The overwhelming emphasis on raw power is balanced with a new sense of order and calm. This shift in style reflects a shift in political ideology. The Assyrian Lamassu screamed, "Bow down or be crushed." The Persian Lamassu whispered, "You are part of a vast, well-ordered and protected world." It was the same mythological creature, but its message had been retranslated for a new, more inclusive empire. This artistic conversation extended far beyond monumental sculpture and into the very colors that adorned the cities. The magnificent Ishtar Gate of Babylon, built by King Nebuchadnezzar II, stands as a perfect example of this synthesis. The gate is undeniably a Babylonian masterpiece, dedicated to the goddess Ishtar and celebrated for its stunning lapis lazuli blue glazed bricks. But the techniques used to create those dazzling, durable glazes and the very concept of lining a processional way with richly decorated walls were refinements of artistic traditions that the Assyrians had pioneered. Even more telling are the animal motifs that parade across its surface. The rows of alternating bulls and dragons, or Cyrushes, are rendered with a vibrant, almost heraldic clarity. While the style is distinct, the underlying principle using powerful animal symbols to represent divine protection and royal authority is a core tenet of Assyrian art. The Babylonians took a familiar visual vocabulary and infused it with their own unique palette and sense of rhythm, creating something that was simultaneously traditional and revolutionary. It wasn't a rejection of the past, but a brilliant remixing of it, proving that cultural influence flows in multiple directions, even from the conquered to the conqueror. The role of royal patronage in this artistic flourishing cannot be overstated. The new emperors of the post-Ashur world understood that art was not a luxury, it was a vital tool of statecraft. By commissioning massive building projects that employed the best artists from across their realms, rulers like Darius the Great of Persia were making a powerful statement. They were demonstrating their wealth, their control over resources and labor, and their ability to harmonize diverse cultural elements into a cohesive whole. The Apadana at Persepolis, with its forest of towering columns and its famous reliefs depicting delegations from every corner of the empire bringing tribute, is the ultimate expression of this. The very structure of the hall, with its grand scale and sophisticated engineering, owes a debt to Assyrian architectural ambition. The reliefs themselves, however, tell a new story. Where Assyrian palace reliefs famously depicted the brutal realities of war, fair sieges, executions, and the looting of cities, the Persian reliefs at Persepolis are a pageant of peaceful procession. They show a world at peace, united in its diversity, bringing its gifts to a benevolent king. The artistic style is a fusion. The precise, detailed carving of the figures is a technical inheritance from Assyria, but the serene, harmonious composition and the celebratory message are distinctly Persian. This was propaganda in its most elegant form, using art to visually articulate the ideology of the Pax Persica. The impact of this great artistic synthesis did not stop at the borders of the Persian Empire. The cultural currents flowing from the fusion of Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian traditions would eventually ripple outward, profoundly influencing the aesthetic development of the classical world. When Greek mercenaries and merchants traveled to the Near East, and when later Greek armies encountered the ruins of Persepolis, they were exposed to this rich composite style. The concept of monumental stone architecture, the use of relief sculpture to narrate stories of power and piety, and even certain mythological creatures began to filter into the Greek artistic consciousness. The iconic griffin, a creature with the body of a lion and the head of an eagle, has its origins in Mesopotamian art but became a staple of Greek decoration. Later, the Romans, who absorbed so much from the Greeks, would further disseminate these Eastern-inspired motifs across Europe. This created an unbroken, though often unacknowledged, chain of artistic inheritance. The winged victories of Greek art and the powerful eagles of Roman standards can trace a part of their lineage back to the symbolic menagerie that once guarded the palaces of Assyria. The cultural diffusion that began with the fall of Ashur ultimately helped to lay the visual foundations for Western art itself, demonstrating that beauty, once created, is never truly lost. It simply finds new forms and new audiences across time and space. The terrifying efficiency of the Assyrian war machine did not vanish from the earth when Nineveh fell. Instead, its blueprints were captured, studied, and meticulously improved upon by the very generals who had overthrown it. The successors to Ashur's empire looked upon its military innovations not as relics of a defeated foe, but as a masterclass in the art of war, a set of tools that, if properly refined, could build an even greater and more durable dominion. The Persian Empire, in particular, became the ultimate student of Assyrian methods, absorbing their core principles while ingeniously adapting them to avoid the fatal flaws of overextension and brutal repression that had ultimately doomed their teachers. This was not simple imitation. It was a conscious evolution, a process of learning from both the triumphs and the failures of history's first true military superpower. At the heart of this evolution was the professionalization of warfare itself. The Assyrians had moved beyond the model of seasonal armies raised from farmers, creating a standing, professional force with standardized equipment and year-round training. The Persians adopted this concept but expanded it on a truly imperial scale. While the Assyrian core was a professional army of Assyrians, the Persian model was one of breathtaking diversity and specialization. The empire's immense manpower reserves allowed it to field a composite army where each ethnic group contributed its unique strengths. There were the Medes and Persians, who provided the superb cavalry that gave the army its speed and striking power. There were the expert archers from the Central Plains, whose volleys of arrows would soften enemy lines before a charge. There were the heavy infantry, often Greeks from Ionia, who formed the unbreakable core of the battle line with their long spears and disciplined formations. This was a military ecosystem, a combined arms approach that the Assyrians had pioneered, but which the Persians perfected by leveraging the entire resources of their multicultural empire. A Persian king could call upon the best horsemen, the best archers, and the best infantry from across continents, creating a force of unparalleled versatility that could adapt to any terrain or threat. Perhaps the most direct and impactful inheritance was in the realm of siege warfare. The Assyrians had been the undisputed masters of the siege, developing a terrifying array of engines to break down city walls, massive battering rams protected by mobile sheds, sophisticated siege towers that allowed archers to rain fire down upon defenders, and teams of sappers who would tunnel under fortifications to collapse them. The coalition that toppled Ashur had to master these very techniques to breach its legendary walls, a bitter lesson learned under fire. The Persians, inheriting an empire filled with fortified cities, made this Assyrian toolkit their own. When Cyrus the Great set his sights on the legendary city of Babylon, he faced a seemingly impossible task. Its walls were famed throughout the ancient world for their height and thickness. Rather than a futile direct assault, Cyrus employed a brilliant stratagem that combined Assyrian-style engineering with psychological insight. According to the historian Herodotus, Cyrus diverted the flow of the Euphrates River, which ran through the center of the city, lowering the water level enough for his special forces to wade into Babylon along the riverbed under the cover of a festival night. This operation required precise hydrological engineering, a skill the Assyrians had mastered, but it was coupled with perfect timing and intelligence on the enemy's activities. It was a masterpiece of tactical innovation built upon a foundation of Assyrian technical knowledge. The logistical backbone of this new military order was without a doubt the royal road and the wider network of highways inherited and expanded from the Assyrians. The ability to move an army is as important as the army itself, and here the Persian advantage was overwhelming. The Assyrians had built roads for the rapid deployment of their legions, but the Persian network was a system of unprecedented scale and maintenance. These were not mere dirt tracks, they were engineered highways wide enough for chariots and supply wagons, with way stations, garrisons, and supply depots at regular intervals. This infrastructure meant that a Persian army under a ruler like Darius I could be mobilized and deployed from the shores of the Aegean to the banks of the Indus with a speed that no contemporary power could match. A rebellion in Egypt could be met by loyal troops from Persia within weeks, not months. This incredible strategic mobility acted as a powerful deterrent against rebellion and allowed the central authority to project power consistently across its vast territories. The military road, an Assyrian invention, became the central nervous system of the Persian peace, ensuring that the empire could not only conquer but could effectively police and protect its domains, creating the stability that allowed trade and culture to flourish. Beyond physical tools and organization, the Persians also mastered the psychological dimension of warfare in a way that reflected a deeper understanding of Assyria's mistakes. The Assyrians had used terror as a deliberate weapon: the impalement of captives, the flaying of rebel kings, the mass deportations were all calculated to crush the spirit of resistance. This worked in the short term, but it bred a seething, deep-rooted hatred that made every conquered province a potential tinderbox. The Persians, by contrast, became masters of a more subtle form of psychological warfare. Their approach was one of magnanimity and calculated mercy. When a city surrendered without a fight, it was treated with leniency, its temples were respected, and its people were spared. But when a city resisted, especially after a prolonged siege, the retribution could be swift and severe, serving as a stark example to others. This created a powerful incentive for compliance. Potential adversaries were faced with a clear choice: accept Persian rule and maintain your way of life, or face the full, organized might of the imperial war machine. This policy broke the will to resist before the first arrow was even fired, saving the empire countless resources and lives, and fostering a grudging acceptance of Persian authority that pure terror could never achieve. The lesson was clear: it is more efficient to manage willing subjects than to constantly repress enraged ones. This strategic evolution reached its zenith in the military reforms of Darius I, a master administrator who systematized the war-making capacity of the empire. He established a clear military hierarchy and a rotational system for raising troops from the satrapies, ensuring a constant and reliable flow of trained soldiers. He also created the elite professional corps known as the Immortals, 10,000 heavy infantrymen who were kept at full strength at all times, their name deriving from the legend that their number was never allowed to fall, as a replacement would immediately fill any vacancy. This unit was the embodiment of the professional soldier ideal, a permanent, ever-ready spearhead for the larger, more diverse imperial army. The success of this evolved military doctrine is evident in the stunning speed and scope of Persian expansion. From the decisive battles that cemented Cyrus's power to the vast, coordinated campaigns of Darius that pushed the empire's borders into Europe and deep into India, the Persian army moved with a logistical precision and tactical flexibility that was the direct heir to and improvement upon the Assyrian model. These military advancements did not just enable conquest, they provided the security and stability upon which the entire economic and political structure of the New World Order rested. The safe passage of merchants, the uniform collection of taxes, and the authority of distant satraps all ultimately relied on the knowledge that the unparalleled might of the king's army could and would be brought to bear anywhere at any time to enforce the peace. Yet to understand how this new world order truly took shape, we must look beyond the grand sweep of armies and empires and into the minds of the remarkable individuals who steered this transformation. The collapse of Ashur didn't just create a power vacuum, it created a stage for leaders of extraordinary vision, figures who saw in the smoldering ruins not an end, but a blueprint for a better future. They were not mere destroyers reveling in conquest. They were master builders who understood that the most durable power is constructed not from fear alone, but from a blend of pragmatism, persuasion, and a profound understanding of the past. They became students of the very empire they had overthrown, dissecting its triumphs and its failures with the keen eye of a strategist learning from a fallen mentor. In doing so, they unlocked the secret to turning a moment of catastrophic collapse into a sustained era of renewal and integration. Consider first the unlikely rise of Nabopolassar, the founder of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty. He was not a foreign invader from a distant land, but a former official who had once served the Assyrian Empire itself. This insider's perspective was his greatest asset. He had witnessed firsthand the overstretched armies, the simmering resentment in the provinces, and the brittle nature of a state reliant on constant intimidation. When he rallied the Babylonians to revolt, his goal was not just independence, but the complete dismantling of the Assyrian yoke. His masterstroke, however, was recognizing he couldn't do it alone. In a move of brilliant diplomatic pragmatism, he forged a strategic alliance with the Medes, a powerful people from the Iranian plateau who are also chafing under Assyrian dominance. This was more than a military pact, it was the creation of an entirely new geopolitical bloc. Nabopolassar, the shrewd administrator, provided the organizational core and the legitimizing claim to Mesopotamia's ancient throne, while the Medes contributed a fierce, mobile army that could match Assyria's famed cavalry. Together, they systematically dismantled the Assyrian heartland, culminating in the sack of Nineveh. Nabopolassar's legacy was one of calculated alliance building, proving that the path to power in this new era required collaboration with former rivals, a lesson in pragmatism that his more famous son would take to even greater heights. That son, Nebuchadnezzar II, inherited not just a kingdom, but a mission to transform Babylon into the undisputed center of the world. If his father was the pragmatic revolutionary, Nebuchadnezzar was the visionary showman and master of soft power. He understood that a truly great empire needed to be more than just feared. It needed to be admired, envied, and remembered. His reign became one of the most ambitious public works projects in history. He poured the wealth of his empire into making Babylon a breathtaking metropolis, a city of legend. The towering Etemenanki ziggurat, believed by many to be the biblical Tower of Babel, reached for the heavens as a statement of divine favor and human ambition. The magnificent Ishtar Gate, with its vibrant blue glazed bricks and procession of sacred animals, was not merely an entrance, it was an immersive experience designed to overwhelm any visitor with the glory of Babylon. His famed hanging gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, were a masterpiece of engineering and botanical artistry, rumored to have been built to comfort a homesick wife. Whether fact or legend, the story itself served his purpose, painting him not as a ruthless conqueror but as a man of culture and deep emotion. Nebuchadnezzar used architecture as his primary tool of propaganda, creating a physical landscape of such splendor that it cemented Babylon's legacy for millennia, demonstrating that the aura of a civilization could be its most powerful and enduring export. But the most transformative figure to emerge from this period was undoubtedly Cyrus the Great of Persia. His approach to empire building was so revolutionary that it still resonates today. Cyrus possessed a quality that set him apart from both the Assyrian tyrants and even the brilliant Nebuchadnezzar, a genuine strategic magnanimity. When his armies marched into Babylon in 539 before the Common Era, they were not met with the desperate resistance that had greeted the Assyrians. Why? Because Cyrus had spent years carefully crafting his image as a liberator. He engaged in a masterful campaign of psychological warfare, not of terror but of promise. He assured the priests of Marduk that their traditions would be respected. He promised the merchant classes that their trade would be protected. And most famously, as recorded on the Cyrus cylinder, he declared that displaced peoples, like the Jews exiled in Babylon, were free to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. This was a breathtaking departure from the standard practice of mass deportation used by the Assyrians to break up cultural blocks. Cyrus realized that a content population is a productive and loyal one. By granting freedom of worship and a degree of cultural autonomy, he turned potential rebels into willing subjects. He didn't just conquer territory, he won over hearts and minds, building a foundation of loyalty that pure military force could never achieve. His genius lay in understanding that the strongest empire is not the one that crushes all difference, but the one that finds strength in diversity. What unified these three very different leaders was their shared ability to learn from history. They looked at the Assyrian Empire and saw a brilliant but flawed machine. They adopted its most effective tools, its administrative structures, its road networks, its professional armies, but they discarded its core philosophy of rule through terror. Nabopolassar learned the power of alliance. Nebuchadnezzar learned the power of spectacle and cultural prestige. Cyrus learned the power of tolerance and inclusion. They each faced immense challenges, from consolidating power after a brutal war to managing vast multi-ethnic populations and fending off external threats. Their success hinged on a blend of personal ambition and a deeper, more pragmatic vision for stability. They were architects who used the rubble of the old world not to build a replica, but to construct something more resilient, more connected, and in many ways more humane. Their stories remind us that at pivotal moments in history, the character and decisions of a few individuals can redirect the course of civilization, turning the page from an age of conquest into an era of foundation. For the vast majority of people living in the shadow of the fallen empire, the collapse of Ashur was not a story of kings and battles, but a deeply personal event that reshaped the very fabric of their daily existence. The initial aftermath was undoubtedly harsh. For farmers in the Tigris Valley, the breakdown of the Assyrian military machine meant the terrifying disappearance of the very force that had, for generations, protected their fields from raiders and enforced a fragile peace. Trade routes were severed, leading to shortages of essential goods, and the complex irrigation systems that sustained agriculture risked falling into disrepair without central coordination. Yet, this period of acute crisis was not a permanent descent into darkness. It was a painful but necessary transition, a societal recalibration that, within a generation, would unlock new forms of freedom and prosperity for ordinary people that had been unimaginable under the rigid, extractive Assyrian state. The old world, built on top-down control, was giving way to something more fluid, where individual initiative and community resilience began to matter more than blind obedience to a distant capital. One of the most profound shifts was in the realm of labor and legal status, particularly concerning slavery. Under the Assyrian Empire, slavery was widespread and brutal, fueled by constant military campaigns that brought in hundreds of thousands of captives to work on royal building projects and vast agricultural estates. This was a system of mass, state-sponsored servitude. The collapse of this war machine dramatically reduced the supply of new slaves. Furthermore, the successor empires, particularly the Persians, had a different economic model. Their vast territories required a stable, taxable population of free farmers and artisans, not a disenfranchised mass of forced laborers. While slavery certainly did not disappear, its character changed. It became less about colossal state projects and more about domestic service, skilled crafts, and debt bondage, a practice where a person would pledge their labor to repay a loan. This shift, while not ideal, represented a move toward a more integrated labor force. A skilled potter who was a debt slave was still a vital part of the local economy, often working alongside free individuals and sometimes having a path to manumission, a prospect that was virtually non-existent for the Assyrian war captive toiling on a royal canal. This transformation was most visible in the burgeoning cities. Urban life under the later empires, especially in metropolises like Babylon, became a vibrant tapestry of opportunity. The Assyrians had built cities primarily as administrative and military centers, with life tightly regulated. Now, cities evolved into cosmopolitan hubs of commerce and culture. The enforced peace of the Persian Empire, the Pax Persica, meant that a merchant from Phoenicia could set up a shop in Babylon with a reasonable expectation of safety, his rights protected by imperial law rather than just local custom. This created a new, socially fluid class of urban professionals. Artisans' guilds grew in influence, allowing craftspeople to collectively set prices, train apprentices, and gain a measure of political voice they never had before. The city was no longer just a place of residence. It was a marketplace of ideas and identities. A person living in Susa or Damascus was no longer defined solely by their ethnic origin or their family's traditional occupation. They could be a Babylonian by birth, a merchant by trade, a worshipper of Aramean gods, and a subject of the Persian king all at once. This multifaceted identity was a direct product of the new, interconnected world that emerged from Ashur's fall. For women, this post-collapse era presented a complex mix of challenges and new, albeit limited, avenues for agency. In the rigidly patriarchal structure of the Assyrian Empire, a woman's legal and economic standing was almost entirely tied to her male relatives, first her father, then her husband. The great societal disruption, however, created cracks in this system. With men away at war or lost in the conflicts, many women were forced to take on roles as heads of household and managers of family businesses. This practical necessity often translated into slightly greater legal recognition in some of the law codes that evolved afterward. There is evidence from Babylonian records of women acting as independent business owners, particularly in the textile and tavern-keeping trades, able to enter into contracts and manage their own property. In the vast diaspora, women were crucial carriers of cultural knowledge, preserving recipes, medicinal remedies, and religious rituals from their Assyrian homelands and blending them with new traditions in the places they settled. While they were still far from achieving equality, the breakdown of the old, rigid social order provided a handful of women with the space to carve out a measure of economic independence and influence that would have been much harder to attain in the highly militarized and centralized Assyrian state. Perhaps the most tangible improvement for the common person was in the realm of infrastructure and daily security. The Assyrian state built impressive roads and canals, but these were primarily for moving armies and extracting wealth. The Persian Empire, in its quest for stable governance, invested in infrastructure as a public good. They maintained the roads not just for soldiers, but for everyone, suppressing banditry and establishing way stations that made long-distance travel safer and more accessible than ever before. For a farmer, this meant he could load his surplus grain onto a cart and take it to a distant city market where prices were better, rather than being forced to sell only to local agents of the state. For a family, it meant that a son could travel to a regional center to learn a specialized craft from a master artisan, a form of practical education that became more widespread. This increased mobility also had a profound impact on healthcare. The enforced peace allowed for the safer travel of physicians and the exchange of medical knowledge. A remedy for a fever discovered by an Egyptian doctor could find its way to a village in Mesopotamia, and the improved roads meant that rare medicinal herbs could be transported across the empire. The state's investment in stability and connectivity trickled down to the most basic aspects of life, reducing the daily risks and expanding the horizons of millions of people. Ultimately, the story of the common person after Ashur's fall is one of resilience and quiet adaptation. The initial shock gave way to a new normal, one characterized by greater personal mobility, more diverse economic opportunities, and a legal environment that, while still harsh by modern standards, was often more predictable and less arbitrary than the rule of the Assyrian king. The community, rather than the imperial palace, became the primary focus of daily life. People identified more strongly with their local city, their trade guild, or their temple, fostering a different kind of cohesion based on shared profession and neighborhood, rather than just forced allegiance to a distant monarch. This grassroots transformation was the true foundation of the New World Order. The grand political alliances and military innovations of kings like Cyrus were only possible because the farmers grew the food, the merchants moved the goods, and the artisans built the cities in a climate of relative security and increasing connectivity. The fall of a giant did not crush the little people. In a strange twist of history, it gave them the space to stand up, to move around, and to become the engine of a more integrated and dynamic world. Imagine carefully brushing away the dust of millennia at the site of Nineveh, the once great Assyrian capital, and finding not a single clean layer of ash marking a definitive end, but instead a complex tapestry of occupation. Beneath the debris from the Median and Babylonian siege, archaeologists have uncovered streets that were resettled, buildings that were repaired, and palaces where new inhabitants made themselves at home, often reusing the very stones that had once proclaimed Assyrian glory. This is the silent testimony of the soil, and it tells a story that directly contradicts the ancient accounts of total annihilation. The physical evidence points not to a vacuum, but to a transition, a gradual handover of power and place where life, in a different form, stubbornly persisted. At Nimrud, ancient Kalhu, the picture is much the same. Excavations have revealed that while the city's political importance vanished, its strategic location and infrastructure remained valuable. Later communities moved in, building their more modest homes among the colossal ruins of the Assyrian palaces. They dug foundations into the debris of the old empire, unknowingly creating the very archaeological layers that would one day show us a continuum of human habitation. These sites are not just cemeteries of a dead civilization. They are palimpsests where one culture wrote over another without entirely erasing what came before, leaving behind a mixed record of destruction and renewal that forces us to rethink what collapse really means. The artifacts unearthed from these layered cities provide the most compelling evidence for a blending of cultures rather than a clean break. Consider the humble but incredibly telling piece of evidence: pottery. Sir Max Mallowan, the renowned archaeologist who worked extensively at Nimrud, paid meticulous attention to the evolution of ceramic styles. He noted that in the levels immediately following the Assyrian collapse, you do not find a sudden, complete replacement of Assyrian pottery with a foreign Babylonian or Median style. Instead, you find a hybrid. The distinctive shapes and fabric of classic Assyrian vessels begin to appear alongside new forms, and soon, local potters are producing wares that combine elements of both traditions. A jar might have an Assyrian body shape but be decorated with a distinctly Babylonian painted design. This is not the work of invaders imposing their own culture wholesale. It is the work of people living side by side, influencing one another, and creating a new, common material culture. Pottery was the plastic of the ancient world, ubiquitous, breakable, and constantly being replaced. Its evolution in the archaeological record is like a slow-motion film of cultural fusion, showing that the people who came after the Assyrians didn't simply reject everything about their predecessors. They adapted, adopted, and innovated, creating a new normal from the pieces of the old. Perhaps the most dramatic evidence of this continuity comes from the fate of the cuneiform tablets. When the palaces of Nineveh were burned, the immense libraries of clay tablets housed within them were subjected to intense heat. While this fire shattered many tablets and turned the shelves to ash, it had an unintended preservative effect, baking the clay and making it far more durable for burial. The most famous of these, the Library of Ashurbanipal, became a time capsule, but the story doesn't end with its destruction. Later Babylonian and Persian rulers, far from dismissing this vast repository of knowledge, actively sought it out. Tablets from Assyrian libraries have been found in later contexts, moved and curated as valuable spoils of war. These weren't just trophies, they were textbooks. The conquerors recognized that these collections contained everything from complex astronomical data and medical treatises to the meticulous administrative records that detailed how to run an empire. The discovery of Assyrian-style cylinder seals in the ruins of Persian administrative buildings is another powerful clue. These seals, used to stamp and authorize official documents, were the functional equivalent of a royal signature. That Persian officials were using seals carved in an Assyrian style, or even reusing actual Assyrian seals, speaks volumes. It means that the bureaucratic machinery, the day-to-day paperwork of governance, continued to operate on a system that was fundamentally Assyrian in design. The new managers had kept the old, proven operating manual. Modern dating methods have been crucial in piecing together the true timeline of this transition, helping to separate the layers of history with scientific precision. Techniques like radiocarbon dating, which analyzes the decay of carbon-14 in organic materials like wood or bone, and thermoluminescence, which can date the last time a piece of pottery was fired, have provided an independent clock. This scientific evidence has helped calibrate the sometimes biased historical accounts written by the victors. For instance, we can now see that the reoccupation of certain Assyrian sites began much sooner after the initial destruction than previously thought, sometimes within a single generation. This wasn't a dark age lasting centuries, it was a rapid recovery and repurposing. The evidence from looted artifacts, often a tragic loss for cultural heritage, has also ironically contributed to this understanding. When artifacts from a plundered Assyrian palace turn up in a grave in Babylon or a foundation deposit in a Persian city, it creates a tangible link between the two cultures. It shows that valuable objects, whether gold jewelry, finely carved ivories, or ceremonial weapons, were circulating, being traded, gifted, or kept as heirlooms. This movement of art and treasure wasn't just random looting. It was a form of cultural exchange, integrating the symbols of the old power into the prestige systems of the new. All of this hard, physical evidence forces a major shift in our modern historiography, our interpretation of history. For a long time, the fall of Ashur was framed through the lens of the biblical prophets and the chronicles of its enemies, who had every reason to portray it as a divine punishment and a total erasure. Archaeology gives a voice to the silent majority, the farmers, the artisans, the merchants who simply kept living their lives. Their story, told through their pottery, their tools, and the foundations of their homes, is one of resilience and practicality. They didn't spend their time mourning a fallen empire. They scavenged its stones to build new walls. They copied its pottery designs to make their own kitchens more efficient. And they worked within the administrative systems that were already in place because they worked. The archaeological record forces us to move beyond the dramatic story of kings and battles and to appreciate the deep, slow currents of everyday life that truly shape human history. It shows that the most profound changes are not always the fastest, and that the collapse of a political system is not synonymous with the death of a culture. The stones and shards, the seals and tablets all whisper the same truth. The New World Order wasn't built on a clean slate, but on the strong, recycled foundations of the old, proving that even the most devastating defeats can be followed by a quiet, stubborn, and continuous renewal. Yet the most profound transformation occurred not on the battlefield or in the marketplace, but within the human mind itself. As the dust settled over the ruins of Ashur, a quiet intellectual revolution began to stir. The collapse of that absolute, terrifying power created a space for doubt, for questioning, and for entirely new ways of understanding humanity's place in the cosmos. For centuries, the Assyrian worldview had been starkly simple. The god Ashur had chosen his people to dominate the world, and the king was his brutal, unassailable agent on earth. Might made right, and power was its own justification. But when that mighty empire fell so spectacularly, it shattered this core belief. People across Mesopotamia and the rising Persian realms were forced to confront a troubling question. If the Assyrians, with all their divine favor and military might, could be so utterly destroyed, then what was the true source of legitimacy? What was the proper way for a ruler to govern, and what was the ultimate nature of justice in an unpredictable world? This crisis of faith became the fertile ground for a remarkable flowering of philosophy, science, and ethical reasoning that would lay the groundwork for the classical age. At the heart of this intellectual shift was the emergence of Zoroastrianism in Persia, a faith that presented a radical new vision of cosmic order. Founded by the prophet Zoroaster, it replaced the chaotic squabbles of the old Mesopotamian pantheons with a grand, universal drama, a struggle between a single supreme god of light, wisdom, and truth, Ahura Mazda, and a destructive spirit of chaos and falsehood, Angra Mainyu. This was not just a new mythology, it was a profound philosophical system. It introduced the revolutionary idea that the universe itself was a moral battleground, and that every human being had a role to play in this cosmic conflict by choosing the path of righteousness or Ashur. For the first time, morality was not just about appeasing a capricious god, it was about aligning oneself with the fundamental order of the universe. This had a direct and transformative impact on political philosophy. The Persian king was no longer a tyrant like the Assyrian rulers, a mere predator who took what he wanted. He was now conceptualized as a steward, a human agent of Ahura Mazda, tasked with fighting the lie and establishing a kingdom of truth and justice on earth. His role was to be a shepherd to his people, not a wolf. This philosophical framework provided a powerful ethical check on power, a concept that would have been unimaginable in the halls of Nineveh. This new emphasis on cosmic justice and ethical governance began to seep into the very fabric of law and administration. We can see its influence in the evolution of legal thought, particularly in the way the law began to be seen as a protective force for the individual, not just a tool for state control. The famous legal code of Hammurabi, with its principle of an eye for an eye, was ancient by this time, but in the post-Assyrian world, there was a discernible shift toward a more nuanced application of justice. The Persians, inspired by Zoroastrian ideals, often allowed conquered peoples to live under their own traditional laws, a policy that implicitly recognized the value of local conceptions of fairness. More importantly, we see the development of legal theories that sought to protect basic rights, especially for the vulnerable. There is evidence from Babylonian legal documents of greater protections for debtors, limits on the terms of servitude, and a more robust system of appeals. Judges were increasingly expected to base their decisions not merely on the letter of the law, but on principles of equity and fairness, often invoking the protection of the weak against the powerful. This was a direct reaction to the Assyrian model of raw, arbitrary power, a collective determination to build a society where the law served as a shield for the people, not just a sword for the king. Simultaneously, in the observatories of Babylon, a different kind of order was being meticulously mapped out in the night sky. Babylonian astronomy, which had deep roots in the Assyrian period, exploded into a truly predictive science in the centuries after the fall. The Assyrians had viewed celestial events primarily as omens, messages from the gods about the fate of the king and the state. The later Babylonian scholars began to strip away the divine mystery and search for the mathematical patterns underlying the movements of the planets. They compiled centuries of observations into precise tables that could predict lunar eclipses and the risings and settings of Venus with astonishing accuracy. This was a monumental intellectual leap. It represented a move from a world based on fear and superstition to one based on reason, observation, and the belief that the universe operated according to consistent, discoverable laws. This shift from omen to science fundamentally changed humanity's relationship with the cosmos. The sky was no longer a terrifying scroll of divine whims, but a complex yet orderly clockwork. This confidence in a rational universe pioneered by Babylonian scholars would become a cornerstone of later Greek natural philosophy, providing the essential data and the intellectual courage for thinkers like Plato and Aristotle to argue that the world could be understood through logic and reason alone. The institutions that preserved and advanced this knowledge were the great libraries and scribble schools that survived the political transition. Places like the Library of Ashur may have been physically destroyed, but the scholarly tradition it represented was far more resilient. Scribes and scholars carrying their precious tablets with them found new patronage in Babylonian temples and later in the Persian court. These institutions became hubs for cross-cultural dialogue, where Babylonian astronomers shared their data with Persian magi, and where Mesopotamian medical texts, with their detailed lists of symptoms and prescriptions, were studied alongside other traditions. This was not a mere storage of information. It was active, collaborative scholarship. The role of the scribe evolved from a simple recorder of royal annals to a genuine intellectual, a preserver of wisdom who could draw on a vast, multinational repository of knowledge to solve practical problems, from calculating the volume of a grain silo to diagnosing a disease. This interconnected intellectual community, spanning from the Indus to the Mediterranean, ensured that the collapse of one political center did not trigger a dark age, but instead dispersed and enriched the pool of human knowledge, creating a fertile, transnational environment for innovation. The impact of this great intellectual awakening would ripple far beyond the boundaries of the Persian Empire, most notably into the budding world of Greek thought. When the first Ionian philosophers like Thales and Anaximander began to speculate about the fundamental substance of the universe, they were not working in a vacuum. They lived on the coast of Anatolia, a land that had been firmly within the Assyrian and then the Persian sphere of influence. The trade routes that carried goods also carried ideas. The Babylonian concept of a lawful, predictable cosmos was a profound influence on these early Greek thinkers. Thales' famous prediction of a solar eclipse in 585 before the Common Era, while likely based on Greek observation, was made possible by the long-term astronomical patterns identified by Mesopotamian science. The very idea that the chaotic diversity of the world could be reduced to a single underlying principle, like Thales' water or Anaximander's boundless, echoes the Zoroastrian quest for a single cosmic order behind the apparent duality of the world. Later, when Herodotus traveled through the Persian Empire and wrote his histories, he was engaging in a form of inquiry that had been nurtured in the intellectual climate of the post-Assyrian world, a world that had learned to look critically at the rise and fall of empires and to seek the human and ethical causes behind historical events. The philosophical and scientific breakthroughs of the Axial Age, so often attributed solely to Greek genius, were in many ways the product of a much older and now shared intellectual ferment that had been catalyzed by the fall of a giant. This fusion of Eastern and Western thought, born from the ashes of Ashur, would ultimately provide the intellectual toolkit for building the modern world. The old model of Assyrian domination, which relied so heavily on the constant, brutal application of military force, was not just logistically exhausting, it was politically brittle. The successors to Ashur's empire, having witnessed its sudden and total collapse, grasped a fundamental truth that the Assyrian kings had missed: conquest is cheap, but control is expensive. To build something that would last, they had to master a new art, one of negotiation and persuasion that could run alongside the ever-present threat of the sword. This was the dawn of a more sophisticated era of statecraft, where diplomacy evolved from a simple prelude to battle into a primary instrument of governance. The goal was no longer just to defeat an enemy, but to bind them to you, to turn a potential rival into a willing partner in a shared system of power. This shift required a new kind of professional, the full-time envoy, the trusted ambassador who could travel between courts, speak multiple languages, and understand the delicate nuances of protocol and prestige. These were not mere messengers, they were the lubricant in the complex machinery of empire, reducing the friction that had so often sparked devastating wars under the old order. Their work created a web of formal relationships that stabilized vast territories, proving that a carefully negotiated agreement could often secure more than a hard-won battlefield victory. At the very core of this new diplomatic framework was the written treaty, a formal document that moved beyond simple oral promises into the realm of sacred, binding law. The Assyrians had used treaties, of course, most famously the vassal treaties of Esarhaddon, which were masterpieces of intimidation, listing in gruesome detail the divine punishments that would befall any local ruler who broke his oath of loyalty. The post-Ashur empires adopted the form but refined its spirit, while these new treaties were still sealed with solemn oaths to the gods invoking Marduk, Ahura Mazda, or a dozen other deities as witnesses and guarantors. The tone often shifted from pure threat to mutual benefit. The language began to emphasize concepts like eternal friendship, peaceful relations, and the advantages of open trade routes. The physical act of inscribing these agreements on clay tablets or stone stelae was itself a powerful innovation. It created a permanent, unchangeable record that could be stored in temple archives and referred to in case of disputes. This moved diplomacy from the ephemeral world of spoken words into the concrete realm of documented precedent. A king could no longer easily deny a commitment his predecessor had made. The treaty stood as a tangible witness, a cornerstone of a more predictable and orderly international system. The single most impactful demonstration of this new diplomatic power was the very alliance that brought down the Assyrian colossus, the Neo-Babylonian Pact. This was not a temporary coalition of convenience, but a strategic, long-term partnership forged by King Nabopolassar of Babylon and the Median leader Cyrus. Its success lay in its clear-eyed division of spoils and responsibilities. The Medes, with their formidable cavalry and knowledge of the northern highlands, would focus on destroying the Assyrian heartland, while the Babylonians, with their wealth and deep cultural legitimacy in Mesopotamia, would secure the south and reclaim the throne of Babylon. This agreement was likely cemented through diplomatic marriages and the exchange of royal hostages, common practices to build trust between ruling families. The result was a coordinated military campaign of stunning effectiveness. Their alliance demonstrated that by pooling resources and recognizing each other's spheres of influence, smaller powers could combine to topple a giant. It was a lesson in the strategic value of partnership that the succeeding Persian Empire would learn and apply on a global scale, showing that the path to ultimate power could be paved with treaties, not just triumphs. The Persian Empire, in particular, elevated this art of diplomatic management to its highest form, yet through its revolutionary system of satrapies. Each satrapy or province was essentially a permanent diplomatic agreement between the central Persian authority and a local power structure. The Persian king did not typically send a foreign governor to impose an alien system. Instead, he would often confirm a local dynast as the satrap, integrating him into the imperial hierarchy. This was a brilliant piece of political judo. It co-opted existing structures of loyalty and authority, giving local elites a vested interest in the stability and success of the empire. In return for their loyalty, the payment of tribute, and the provision of troops for the imperial army, these satraps were granted remarkable autonomy. They could mint their own coins, follow their own customs, and worship their own gods. The famous Cyrus cylinder is the ultimate expression of this policy, portraying Cyrus the Great not as a conqueror but as a restorer of legitimate local order, returning displaced peoples and their gods to their homes. This was diplomacy as a system of governance, a way to rule millions of people without the constant, draining effort of crushing their culture and identity. It created a framework where the costs of rebellion were made painfully clear, but the benefits of compliance were equally tangible. Beyond the formal structures of treaties and satrapies, a subtle economy of gift exchange and royal hospitality functioned as the daily grease of international relations. The exchange of lavish gifts between courts was not mere generosity. It was a sophisticated language of power, alliance, and status. A Persian king might send a neighboring ruler a gift of exquisite gold jewelry, fine textiles, or rare spices. To accept the gift was to acknowledge the giver's superiority and friendship. To refuse it was a grave insult and a potential casus belli. These exchanges created bonds of obligation and reciprocity that could be more binding than a written clause. Royal courts became stages for this diplomatic theater, where envoys were feasted and honored, not just to show respect, but to demonstrate the wealth and power of the host kingdom. The goal was to awe the visitor, to make them return to their own king with stories of the empire's boundless resources and magnanimous spirit. This soft power was a crucial complement to hard power. A well-hosted ambassador could dissuade a king from joining a rebellious coalition far more effectively than 1,000 soldiers camped on his border, because he had built a relationship of personal respect and perceived mutual interest. The long-term success of this new diplomatic paradigm is perhaps best illustrated by its ability to manage relations with powers outside the direct control of the empire, a concept perfectly captured by the Peace of Calais. While the exact historical details are debated by scholars, the tradition speaks of a formal treaty signed around the mid-5th century before the Common Era between the Persian Empire and the rising power of Athens. After decades of bitter warfare during the Persian Wars, this agreement effectively drew a line in the sand. It stipulated that the Persian navy would not sail into the Aegean Sea, and the Athenian army would not campaign in Asia Minor. Here was a treaty not between a master and a subject, but between two weary superpowers acknowledging a stalemate. It created a stable, if tense, coexistence that allowed both empires to focus their energies elsewhere for a generation. The Peace of Calais demonstrates how the diplomatic tools forged in the aftermath of Ashur's fall, the formal treaty, the recognition of spheres of influence, the establishment of buffer zones, had become the standard operating procedure for international relations across the Mediterranean world. It showed that even between fierce rivals, negotiation could create a more sustainable and predictable peace than the endless cycle of war and rebellion that had characterized the age of Assyrian dominance. This was the ultimate legacy of the diplomatic revolution, the understanding that the most resilient empires are those built not just on the fear they inspire, but on the agreements they keep. In the immediate aftermath of the Assyrian collapse, you might expect the bustling trade routes that had been the empire's lifeblood to have simply withered away, plunging the region into an economic dark age. But something far more remarkable happened. Instead of grinding to a halt, commerce simply rerouted itself, like water finding a new path around a collapsed dam. The initial disruption was real. Of course, caravans that had once moved under the protection of the Assyrian army now faced bandits and shifting political loyalties. Yet, this very chaos forced merchants to become more agile, more creative, and ultimately more resilient. They could no longer rely on a single imperial superpower to guarantee their safety. So they diversified. A merchant who once sent all his goods due north to Ashur might now split his cargo, sending one shipment west to the Phoenician coast by sea, and another east along newly emerging land routes through the rising Persian domains. This wasn't just a change in destination, it was a fundamental shift in strategy. By spreading their risk across multiple networks and political entities, these ancient businesspeople created a system that was no longer dependent on the health of one single empire. The economy itself became antifragile, actually gaining strength from the shocks it encountered, because it was forced to evolve into a more complex and interconnected web. This new environment of risk and opportunity became a powerful catalyst for financial innovation. With longer, more uncertain journeys becoming the norm, merchants needed better ways to manage their capital and protect their investments. This is when we see the emergence of sophisticated banking practices that feel surprisingly modern. In the major commercial centers like Babylon, family firms began to operate as proto-banks. They would accept deposits of silver or grain from one merchant and extend lines of credit to another, effectively creating money through ledger entries. A trader from Lydia could deposit his funds with a reputable Babylonian banking house, receive a clay tablet as a receipt, and then use that tablet to secure credit or make purchases in Egypt without the immense danger of physically transporting heavy precious metals across the desert. This was the birth of a formalized credit system, Alongside credit, we see the development of insurance-like agreements. For a premium paid upfront, a merchant could secure a contract that would forgive a loan if his ship sank or his caravan was plundered. This wasn't called insurance, but it served the exact same purpose, pooling risk to make daring, long-distance trade a viable, calculated gamble rather than a sheer act of folly. Standardized contracts, often written in the universal Aramaic script on parchment or papyrus, became commonplace, reducing disputes and building a foundation of trust between partners who might never meet face to face. The lifeblood of this reinvigorated economy was the unprecedented movement of luxury goods, which now flowed along routes that stretched for thousands of miles. Imagine a single strand of silk beginning its journey in a workshop in far-off China, traveling across the treacherous steppes of Central Asia, changing hands at bustling Central Asian oases, then being carried by Persian merchants to the ports of the Levant, before finally being loaded onto a Phoenician ship bound for the palace of a Greek aristocrat. This entire chain linking the Pacific to the Mediterranean was now possible. It wasn't just silk, it was spices like cinnamon and pepper from India, incense from Arabia, and exquisite lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. The demand for these status symbols in the new wealthy courts of Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt created powerful economic incentives that drove exploration and cemented diplomatic ties. This wasn't trivial trade in baubles, it was the high-tech sector of the ancient world, fueling advancements in navigation, logistics, and cross-cultural negotiation. The profits from these luxuries were so immense that they funded the construction of new ports, the clearing of new caravan tracks, and the establishment of trading colonies in previously remote areas, permanently altering the economic geography of the entire hemisphere. No one capitalized on this new reality better than the Phoenicians. With the Assyrian naval threat eliminated, these master mariners from cities like Tyre and Sidon launched a veritable golden age of maritime expansion. They didn't just sail existing routes, they pioneered new ones, pushing past the Strait of Gibraltar into the Atlantic, founding colonies like Carthage on the North African coast, Gades in Spain, and even venturing as far north as Cornwall in Britain for its precious tin. These colonies were not mere trading posts, they were full-fledged, independent cities that replicated Phoenician culture and commercial practices. This created a decentralized network of economic hubs that operated with a remarkable degree of autonomy. If a war disrupted trade in the eastern Mediterranean, the western nodes of the network, like Carthage, could continue to thrive and even expand their own influence. This was the ultimate expression of economic resilience, a polycentric web of commerce that no single king or empire could fully control or extinguish. The Phoenicians became the essential connectors, the global supply chain managers of the ancient world, and their success demonstrated that in the power vacuum left by a fallen giant, the greatest power could often be wielded by those who mastered the arts of trade and navigation, not just conquest. Underpinning all this activity was a quiet revolution in the countryside agricultural innovation that created the surplus needed to sustain growing urban populations and fuel long-distance trade. The Persian Empire, in particular, actively promoted agricultural improvements as a matter of state policy. They inherited and vastly expanded the Assyrian expertise in irrigation, building elaborate underground canals known as Qanats to bring water to arid plains, turning previously marginal lands into productive farms. New crops were introduced and cultivated more systematically. The increased use of iron tools, now more widely available thanks to the diffusion of Assyrian metallurgical knowledge, made farming more efficient. This agricultural boom had a cascading effect. A farmer with a surplus of grain could sell it to feed a weaver in a city, who could then produce fine cloth to be traded for that Chinese silk or Arabian incense. This specialization of labor, supported by reliable food supplies, was the bedrock of economic complexity. Furthermore, the Persian administration's investment in grain storage facilities acted as a buffer against famine, stabilizing prices and preventing the kind of food crises that could lead to social unrest and disrupt trade for years. The economic resilience of the era was, therefore, not just the story of brave merchants and savvy bankers, but also of anonymous farmers whose increased productivity, supported by state-level investment, created the fundamental wealth that made everything else possible. This vibrant, self-organizing economic system did more than just prevent a total collapse. It actively funded the cultural and intellectual golden age that followed. The taxes on trade filled the coffers of the Neo-Babylonian and Persian kings, who then poured that wealth into magnificent building projects like the Ishtar Gate and the palace at Persepolis, employing thousands of artisans, architects, and laborers. The safe passage of ideas along these same trade routes meant that a Babylonian astronomical observation could influence a Greek philosopher, or a Mesopotamian medical text could find its way to an Egyptian physician. The economic dynamism born from the ashes of Ashur created a world where not only goods but knowledge became a highly valued commodity, creating a virtuous cycle of prosperity, stability, and innovation. The merchants, often seen as mere profiteers, were in fact the unsung architects of a new interconnectedness, proving that the most enduring networks are not always built by imperial decree, but can emerge organically from the collective action of countless individuals seeking opportunity amidst the ruins of the old order. While the world of kings and armies was being remade by force, a much quieter yet infinitely more enduring revolution was taking place in the scriptoriums and libraries of the ancient world. In the chaotic aftermath of Ashur's collapse, as palaces smoldered and populations scattered, a dedicated class of individuals, the scribes and scholars, became the unsung heroes of civilization's continuity. Their mission was not to wield a sword, but to wield a stylus, and their battlefield was the clay tablet. They understood that the true wealth of an empire was not stored in its treasuries, but in its accumulated knowledge, the legal codes that defined justice, the medical texts that offered healing, the astronomical records that mapped the heavens, and the epic literature that gave meaning to human existence. As political structures crumbled around them, these custodians of culture worked with a profound sense of purpose, ensuring that the intellectual legacy of Assyria was not buried in the rubble, but carefully gathered, preserved, and translated for the use of future generations. They were the human bridges spanning the chasm between empires, guaranteeing that the hard-won wisdom of one age would become the foundational textbook for the next. The epicenter of this preservation effort was the legendary library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. This was no mere collection of scrolls. It was a conscious, ambitious project by one of the last great Assyrian kings to gather all significant knowledge of the known world under a single roof. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a comprehensive digital archive, a repository for everything from royal correspondence and administrative receipts to epic poetry and advanced scientific treatises. When the city fell, this library was sacked and burned, but in a cruel twist of fate, the very fire that destroyed the building helped preserve its contents. The intense heat baked the thousands of clay tablets within, hardening them into a ceramic-like durability that allowed them to survive for millennia buried in the ruins. While many were shattered, a staggering number remained intact, waiting for archaeologists to unearth them, but the story doesn't end with their burial. The conquerors, particularly the Babylonians, recognized the immense value of this captured knowledge. Tablets from Ashurbanipal's library were not left in the dirt. they were systematically collected and carried off to Babylon as the most precious kind of spoils. The new rulers were not just looting gold, they were looting intellectual capital, understanding that these texts contained the operating manual for running a complex state and advancing human understanding. This work of preservation relied on a highly trained and disciplined class of professionals, the scribes. Becoming a scribe was not a casual pursuit, it was a grueling, multi-year apprenticeship that began in childhood. In dedicated schools, often attached to temples or palaces, young students would spend years mastering the incredibly complex cuneiform writing system, which consisted of hundreds of wedge-shaped signs, each with multiple potential meanings and sounds. They practiced by endlessly copying and recopying standard texts, from vocabulary lists and mathematical tables to excerpts from the Epic of Gilgamesh. This rigorous training did more than just teach them how to write. It immersed them in the entire cultural and scientific tradition of Mesopotamia. A graduating scribe was not merely a secretary, he was a walking library, a legal expert, a budding astronomer, and a keeper of religious ritual. When the empire fell, these highly skilled individuals were not rendered obsolete. On the contrary, their expertise became their passport. Scribes who had once served the Assyrian court found ready employment in the chanceries of Babylonian kings and later in the vast administrative machinery of the Persian Empire. They carried the entire system in their heads and in their hands, ensuring a seamless transition of bureaucratic practice and intellectual tradition. The physical act of preserving this knowledge was a testament to human ingenuity. The primary writing material was the humble clay tablet. Scribes would take a lump of wet, refined clay and shape it into a portable, pillow-sized form. Using a stylus made of reed or bone, they would then impress the cuneiform signs into the soft surface. For everyday administrative documents, the tablet might be left to dry in the sun. But for texts intended to last, legal codes, royal annals, literary works, the tablets were fired in kilns, making them as durable as pottery. For longer works, a series of tablets would be created, each one labeled with its sequence number and a catch line from the previous tablet to keep them in order. Alongside clay, other materials played a crucial role, especially as empires expanded. The Aramaic language, with its simple alphabetic script, was often written on parchment or papyrus, which was lighter and more portable for administrators on the move. While these organic materials have largely perished, we know from references and rare survivals that this dual system of clay for permanence and parchment for practicality allowed knowledge to be both preserved and disseminated with remarkable efficiency across the vast distances of the new empires. The temples of the ancient world served as the enduring engines of this cultural preservation. Long after palaces had been abandoned, temples often remained, their priesthoods providing a thread of institutional continuity. These were not just places of worship, they were the universities and research centers of their day. Temple complexes housed schools for scribal training, archives for legal and economic documents, and libraries for scholarly texts. The Temple of Marduk in Babylon, known as the Esagila, and similar institutions in cities like Sippar and Uruk, became new custodians of the knowledge that had once been centralized in Assyria. Priests and scholars within these temples did not simply store the old Assyrian tablets, they actively engaged with them. They would recopy crumbling old tablets to create fresh, legible versions, often adding updated commentaries or corrections in the margins. They compiled new works based on the old, synthesizing Assyrian astronomical observations with their own to create more accurate predictive models. The temple provided the stable, long-term environment and the political patronage necessary for scholarship to flourish, even as dynasties rose and fell outside its walls. This decentralized network of temple libraries ensured that knowledge was no longer vulnerable to the destruction of a single capital city, but was distributed and replicated across the entire region. One of the most significant impacts of this preservation effort was the active translation and adaptation of texts. As Aramaic grew to become the administrative lingua franca of the Persian Empire, there was a concerted effort to translate key cuneiform texts into this new, more accessible language. This was not a word-for-word transcription, but a process of cultural translation. A Babylonian scholar might take an Assyrian medical text listing diagnoses based on symptoms and omens and adapt it, perhaps stripping away some of the more overtly supernatural explanations while keeping the empirical observations about the illness itself. Legal concepts from the harsh Assyrian law codes were softened and integrated into the more nuanced Babylonian and later Persian legal systems. This process of translation ensured that knowledge remained living and relevant, not a dead artifact to be stored away. It allowed the practical wisdom of one civilization to be understood and applied by another, creating a common intellectual toolkit that spanned from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. The knowledge was no longer Assyrian or Babylonian. It became a shared human resource, a foundation upon which anyone could build. The real-world benefits of this centuries-long project of preservation are stunningly clear in fields like medicine and astronomy. Consider the diagnostic handbook attributed to the Assyrian scholar priest Esagil-Kinupli, a text that was meticulously preserved and studied for centuries after his death. This work organized diseases by their symptoms from head to toe and proposed specific treatments involving herbs, bandages, and rituals. When this text was carried into the Babylonian tradition, it became the basis for further medical advancement. Later Greek physicians who traveled and studied in the East were exposed to this long tradition of Mesopotamian medicine. While they famously developed their own theories about bodily humors, their practical treatments and pharmacological knowledge owe a significant, though often unacknowledged, debt to the preserved medical lore of Assyria and Babylon. In astronomy, the legacy is even more direct. The Babylonians are famed for their ability to predict lunar eclipses and planetary movements with uncanny accuracy. This capability was not developed in a vacuum. It was built upon centuries of meticulous night sky observations recorded by their Assyrian predecessors. The great compilation of astronomical omens known as Enuma Anu Enlil was an Assyrian-era text that became a cornerstone of Babylonian predictive astronomy. The data within it was so precise that it was used by the Greek astronomer Hipparchus centuries later and formed part of the basis for the Ptolemaic model of the universe. The chain of knowledge is unbroken, linking an Assyrian stargazer to a Babylonian calculator to a Greek cosmologist. This unwavering commitment to preserving culture, even amidst the chaos of imperial collapse, reveals something profound about the human spirit. In the face of political failure, military defeat, and social upheaval, the drive to safeguard knowledge represents a profound vote of confidence in the future. It is a declaration that our stories, our discoveries, and our laws are worth saving, that they have value beyond the lifetime of the king who commissioned them or the empire that produced them. The scribes who recopied a cracked tablet, the scholars who translated a complex text into a new language, and the kings who funded libraries were all participating in a grand, collective project that transcended their immediate circumstances. They were building a ladder of progress, each generation standing on the shoulders of the one that came before, not by accident, but by deliberate and painstaking effort. This legacy demonstrates that the most resilient power in history is not the power to destroy, but the power to remember, to learn, and to pass that learning on. It is a lesson that echoes through the ages, reminding us that our own civilization's greatest treasures may not be in its vaults of gold, but in its libraries of ideas and in our collective will to keep them safe for those who are yet to be. Imagine the sheer weight of a legal decision, not just on the lives of the people involved, but on the very structure of civilization itself. This was the profound inheritance that fell into the hands of the empires that succeeded Ashur. They didn't find a legal wasteland. They discovered a sophisticated, time-tested framework for justice that had governed everything from international trade agreements to the price of a loaf of bread. The Assyrian legal system was a complex organism, built not around a single, famous codex like Hammurabi's, but on a living tradition of royal decrees, court precedents, and standardized contracts that had evolved over centuries. Its genius lay in its meticulous attention to the practicalities of a complex society. For the conquerors, this was a treasure trove. To discard it would have been an act of monumental foolishness. Instead, they became its most diligent students, recognizing that the true secret to governing their vast, new, multi-ethnic realms was not to impose a completely foreign system, but to refine the one that was already proven to work, adapting its core principles to build a more stable and, in some cases, a more just world. One of the most significant and direct transfers occurred in the realm of commerce and contract law. The Assyrians had developed an incredibly detailed set of rules governing business transactions to facilitate their vast trade networks. Contracts for the sale of goods, the leasing of farmland, or the formation of business partnerships were not simple handshake deals. They were formal, written documents, typically inscribed on clay tablets in the presence of witnesses. These contracts specified the obligations of each party, the timelines for delivery or payment, and the penalties for default. The Babylonians and later the Persians absorbed this practice wholeheartedly, but they introduced a crucial innovation aimed at preventing abuse: reforms to debt law. In the Assyrian system, a debtor who could not repay a loan could be forced into a form of debt slavery, where they or a family member would work off the debt. This was a common practice, but it carried the risk of creating a permanent underclass. The Babylonian legal reforms, particularly those reflected in the so-called Misharam Acts or Edicts of Justice, would periodically proclaim a general cancellation of certain debts or a release from debt slavery. This wasn't random kindness, it was a calculated economic and social policy. By preventing the total destitution of its citizen farmers, the state maintained a stable, taxable population and avoided the social unrest that could boil over into rebellion. This evolution shows a clear progression in legal thought from a system that enforced contracts with brutal efficiency to one that began to consider the long-term health of the entire societal body, moving toward a concept of equity that balanced the rights of the creditor with the survival of the debtor. The very machinery of justice, the courts and the judges who presided over them, also represented a vital inheritance. The Assyrians had established a hierarchical court system, with local elders resolving minor village disputes and royal judges handling more serious cases involving property, capital crimes, or appeals. The role of the judge was not merely to listen to arguments but to actively investigate the facts. They were empowered to call witnesses, demand the production of written evidence like contracts or receipts, and even order oaths sworn in the name of the gods, which held immense social and religious weight. This emphasis on evidence and procedure was a monumental leap forward from justice based solely on accusation or ordeal. The successor empires adopted this entire judicial structure. In the Persian Empire, for example, royal judges traveled the satrapies, ensuring that local courts were applying the law consistently. The concept of an appeals process, where a dissatisfied party could petition a higher authority, sometimes even the king himself for a review of their case, became a cornerstone of imperial administration. This provided a crucial check on corruption and the arbitrary power of local officials. For an ordinary farmer who felt wronged by a powerful local landowner, the knowledge that a royal judge might hear his case was a powerful deterrent against injustice and a tangible symbol of a larger, overarching legal order that theoretically applied to everyone. This legal continuity had a profound impact on the most intimate aspects of daily life, particularly within the family. Assyrian law contained extensive statutes governing marriage, inheritance, and the rights of women and children. A marriage was a legal contract, often involving the payment of a bride price. Divorce was permitted, but the laws carefully outlined the financial settlements, especially regarding the return of the bride price and the disposition of any dowry. While these laws were patriarchal by modern standards, granting men greater authority, they also provided women with certain defined legal protections. A wife had rights to support, and in cases of divorce without proper cause, she was entitled to a financial settlement. The Babylonians and Persians integrated these family law principles, but again we see a subtle evolution. Some Babylonian laws, for instance, offered women slightly more agency in initiating divorce under specific circumstances, and there is evidence of women acting as independent parties in property disputes and business dealings in the Persian period. The preservation and adaptation of these family laws provided a stable framework for social organization. They regulated the transfer of property between generations, defined the lines of inheritance, and established clear social roles, which in turn reduced conflicts and created a predictable environment for communities to thrive. The law was not just about punishing crime. It was the invisible architecture that held the family, the basic unit of society, together. The transmission of these legal ideas did not stop at the borders of the Persian Empire. They became part of the intellectual currency of the ancient world, flowing along the trade routes and through the administrative centers, eventually influencing the legal foundations of the classical world. When the Roman Empire began to expand and formalize its own legal system, it did not develop in a vacuum. Roman jurists and administrators were keen observers of the Eastern empires they encountered and eventually conquered. Core concepts that we now associate with Roman law, the supreme importance of written evidence, the formal role of witnesses, the distinction between different types of property, and even certain contract law principles bear a striking resemblance to the legal traditions that had been honed in Mesopotamia for over a millennium. The Roman emphasis on stipulatio, a formal oral contract made through a specific question and answer ritual, echoes the Assyrian and Babylonian focus on the formalities of agreement. While Roman law would eventually become far more complex and systematic, its early development was undoubtedly fertilized by the rich legal soil of the Near East. The Assyrian legacy in law, therefore, is not a forgotten relic, but a foundational layer in the long, continuous story of Western jurisprudence, a testament to the power of practical wisdom to endure long after the empire that first codified it had turned to dust. Now, let's shift our perspective from the grand halls of power to the very ground beneath the feet of empires, the rivers, mountains, and soil that silently dictated the terms of survival and success. The story of Ashur's transformation is not just one of kings and armies. It is profoundly a story of the land itself. The Tigris and Euphrates valleys, that fertile crescent that had nourished the Assyrian heartland, did not lose their value when the empire's banners fell. Their rich, alluvial soils remain the most coveted prize in the ancient world, a geographic lottery ticket that every emerging power was desperate to claim. Control of this land meant control of the food supply, and in an age where agricultural surplus was the fundamental source of wealth, this was the ultimate strategic objective. The Babylonian kings understood this perfectly. By seizing the Mesopotamian core, they instantly inherited the agricultural engine that had fueled Assyrian campaigns, allowing them to feed a massive population and finance their own legendary building projects in Babylon. But the land was more than just a breadbasket. It was a strategic chessboard. The same river valleys that provided fertility also served as natural highways and barriers. An army marching along the Euphrates was moving along a ready-made supply line with water and fertile land for foraging, while the surrounding deserts and mountain ranges channeled movement, forcing trade and conflict into predictable corridors that could be controlled from fortified cities. The geography that had enabled Ashur's rise now set the stage for its successors, proving that while empires are transient, the strategic value of a great river valley is forever. Environmental pressures likely played a silent but decisive role in weakening the Assyrian giant, even as they created openings for others. Centuries of intensive agriculture to support growing cities and a massive army would have placed an enormous strain on the land. Historians and archaeologists point to evidence of deforestation in the Assyrian highlands, as timber was harvested for construction, fuel for kilns, and to build the vast fleets of siege engines and ships. Without tree roots to hold the soil in place, the hillsides would have become vulnerable to erosion, with precious topsoil washing down into the river valleys, potentially silting up the intricate irrigation canals that were the lifeblood of Mesopotamian farming. At the same time, subtle shifts in climate patterns may have prolonged droughts or caused unpredictable flooding, disrupting the agricultural calendar and leading to famines that undermined state authority and fueled social unrest. The Assyrian state, for all its bureaucratic power, was ultimately fragile, built on an agricultural base that could be broken by a series of bad harvests. This environmental stress created a kind of push factor, driving populations to migrate from less viable lands in search of more stable environments. Ironically, this movement of people became a vehicle for the very diffusion of Assyrian knowledge and skills we discussed earlier. The hardship in the heartland forced innovation elsewhere, as migrants carried their agricultural techniques to new regions, adapting them to different soils and climates, and in turn enriching the broader economic landscape. The response to these challenges sparked a revolution in water management, one of the most critical adaptations of the post-Ashur era. The Assyrians had been brilliant hydraulic engineers, but their systems were often designed for large-scale, state-controlled projects aimed at supplying their colossal capital cities. The successor empires, particularly the Persians, took this knowledge and applied it with a different, more sustainable philosophy. Their masterpiece was the Qanat system. Imagine a gently sloping underground tunnel, tapped into a water-bearing layer in the foothills of a mountain, with a series of vertical access shafts dug along its length to allow for construction and maintenance. This simple but labor-intensive technology allowed the Persians to transport water across dozens of miles of arid plateau without losing a drop to evaporation. It was a game-changer. Where the Assyrians had focused on dominating the great river valleys, the Persians used the Qanat to unlock the agricultural potential of the Iranian plateau itself. This decentralized, community-maintained system was less vulnerable to the collapse of a central authority than a massive, state-run canal network. It turned previously marginal lands into flourishing oases, supporting new cities and freeing the Persian Empire from an over-reliance on the volatile Mesopotamian floodplain. This was resilience through geographical diversification. By mastering a new kind of landscape, they built an empire that was not tied to the fate of a single river system. This mastery of diverse geography directly translated into unparalleled control over trade and communication. The Persian Empire's heartland on the Iranian plateau was a strategic masterstroke. It was a natural fortress protected by the Zagros Mountains to the west and vast deserts to the east, making it incredibly difficult to invade. Yet, from this secure base, it sat astride the world's most important land bridge, connecting the Aegean world with the riches of India and Central Asia. The Persian kings didn't just occupy this space, they weaponized it through infrastructure. The royal road was the ultimate expression of this, but it was built upon a pre-existing understanding of geography. The road followed the most efficient paths through mountain passes and skirted the most deadly stretches of desert, linking a chain of fertile valleys and secure harbors. By controlling the plateau, the Persians controlled the valves of continental trade. They could guarantee safe passage for caravans carrying lapis lazuli from Afghanistan to Babylon, or spices from India to the ports of the Levant. They could also move their own armies with shocking speed to crush revolts in Egypt or confront Greeks on the coast of Anatolia. Their geographical position allowed them to dominate both land and sea routes. The Persian Gulf became a Persian lake, and the great Phoenician ports, though autonomous, ultimately served the economic system that Persia guaranteed. The empire became the essential middleman, and its geographical savvy was the reason why. The enduring lesson from this geographical perspective is one of adaptation rather than mere location. Ashur's heartland was, and still is, phenomenally well endowed, but its very fertility may have bred a certain dependency, a focus on intensive exploitation that ultimately made the system vulnerable. The empires that followed learned to think more broadly. They looked at the entire chessboard, the river valleys, the high plateaus, the mountain passes, and the seacoasts, and built systems that integrated these diverse landscapes into a cohesive whole. The Persian Empire was resilient precisely because it was not a single, monolithic geographical entity. If there was a drought in Mesopotamia, the harvests from the hills of Anatolia or the Qanat watered fields of Iran could compensate. If a trade route was blocked by conflict in one region, goods could be rerouted through another. This geographical diversification was the ultimate insurance policy. It teaches us that resilience in the face of change, whether environmental or political, is not about finding the one perfect spot and holding onto it forever. It is about understanding the strengths and weaknesses of different environments, building flexible networks that can absorb shocks, and having the wisdom to manage resources not just for maximum extraction, but for long-term stability. The land shaped the fall of Ashur, but it was the human capacity to learn from that land and adapt to its broader possibilities that truly built the New World Order. It's a story we've heard time and again in history books and documentaries. The fearsome Assyrian Empire, a brutal war machine, finally gets its due, collapsing in a storm of fire and vengeance, its culture wiped from the earth as if it never was. This dramatic image of utter annihilation is powerful, but it's also profoundly misleading. The most persistent myth we need to dismantle is the idea of a clean break, a total erasure. We picture the smoldering ruins of Nineveh and assume that was the final curtain call for everything Assyrian. Yet, the archaeological record tells a completely different, far more interesting story. Digging into the layers of soil at sites like Nimrud or Khorsabad, archaeologists don't find a single layer of ash marking a definitive end, followed by emptiness. Instead, they find evidence of continuous habitation. People moved back in. They rebuilt using the very stones of the fallen palaces. They cooked in Assyrian-style pots that gradually began to feature new Babylonian designs. This isn't evidence of a culture vanishing. It's the physical proof of a culture being absorbed, of a civilization transitioning into a new phase. Its people and their everyday lives continuing on, adapting to new rulers while holding onto the practical tools and traditions that work. The political entity called the Assyrian Empire was defeated, but the Assyrian people and their knowledge did not disappear into a historical black hole. Another deeply ingrained misconception is the reduction of the Assyrians to one-dimensional villains of the ancient world, remembered solely for the terrifying reliefs of their kings impaling rebels and laying waste to cities. This caricature of pure brutality ignores their staggering contributions as innovators and intellectuals. Yes, their military tactics were fearsome, but that same relentless drive for efficiency also fueled advancements that benefited humanity for centuries. While their armies were conquering, their scholars were compiling the world's first great library under Ashur, a collection designed not for war but for wisdom. Within those clay tablets were meticulous medical texts that systematically described symptoms and proposed treatments, laying groundwork for future medicine. Their astronomers mapped the night sky with such precision that their data was used by Babylonian and later Greek scientists. To label them as only warriors is like remembering Einstein only for his hairstyle. It completely misses the point of their profound legacy. Their brutality was a tool of statecraft, a dark and undeniable part of their history, but it was not the sum total of their civilization. By focusing only on the violence, we blind ourselves to their role as builders, administrators, and preservers of knowledge, the very roles that ensured their influence would long outlive their empire. This leads directly to the third great myth, the idea that the fall of Ashur plunged the region into a dark age. The image of libraries burning and cities emptying certainly suggests a descent into ignorance and chaos. But history is rarely so simple. Think of it not as a light being extinguished, but as a candle flame being used to light many others. The collapse of the central Assyrian state did cause disruption, but it also forced a dispersal of its most valuable resource, its educated elite. Assyrian scribes, engineers, and administrators didn't just vanish. They found employment in the new regimes. They brought their skills in law, accounting, and hydrology to the courts of Babylon and the budding Persian Empire. The knowledge contained in those burned libraries wasn't lost. It was often carried off as the most valuable spoils of war. Conquering kings wanted those administrative manuals and scientific texts because they were the blueprints for running a complex state. The so-called Dark Age was, in reality, a period of intense and fruitful fermentation, where Assyrian ideas were mixed with Babylonian, Median, and Persian traditions, creating a richer, more hybrid culture. It was a transfer of power, not a loss of knowledge, and the intellectual light of Mesopotamia, far from dimming, was in fact spread across a wider area. Why do these myths persist so stubbornly? A large part of the answer lies in the nature of our sources. Our most vivid accounts of the Assyrian fall come from their enemies, the Babylonians who overthrew them, and the Hebrew prophets who saw them as an instrument of divine punishment. The biblical book of Nahum, for example, gleefully celebrates the destruction of Nineveh in blood-curdling detail. The Babylonian chronicles understandably portray their victory as a righteous triumph over a monstrous oppressor. These are the voices of the victors, and they have every reason to paint a picture of total, deserved annihilation. They were crafting a narrative to legitimize their own new power and to provide a satisfying moral lesson. The cruel empire got what was coming to it. Archaeology, which gives a voice to the silent majority, the farmers, the potters, the merchants, often tells a more mundane and continuous story. It shows us that for most people, life went on. The tax collector might now speak a different language or represent a different king, but the fields still needed to be planted, the contracts still needed to be sealed, and the gods still needed to be appeased. The dramatic, moralistic tale of a clean defeat is simply more compelling and easier to digest than the complex, messy reality of cultural and administrative continuity. Ultimately, clinging to these myths does a great disservice to our understanding of how civilization actually works. It reinforces a simplistic view of history as a series of rises and falls, of good guys and bad guys, of clean endings and new beginnings. The real story of Ashur's legacy is a testament to the incredible resilience of ideas. It shows us that the collapse of a political system is not the same as the death of a culture. Administrative systems, legal principles, artistic techniques, and scientific knowledge are remarkably portable and durable. They are tools, and valuable tools are rarely thrown away, they are repurposed. When we look at the grand audience hall of the Persian kings at Persepolis, we are not looking at something built in opposition to Assyria, but upon its foundations. The very concept of a sprawling, centralized empire governing diverse peoples was an Assyrian innovation that the Persians refined. The Lamassu figures that guard its gates are direct descendants of the Assyrian guardians, even if their expression is a little more serene. By debunking the myth of total destruction, we can finally see the true nature of this historical transition, not a death but a metamorphosis. It allows us to appreciate the Assyrians not as mere monsters or a failed civilization, but as foundational contributors to the ancient world's toolkit, whose most enduring victories were won not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, persistent legacy of their ideas. But to truly grasp the uniqueness of Ashur's story, we need to step back and place it on a broader canvas, comparing its collapse to other great declines throughout history. When we do, a fascinating pattern emerges, one that challenges our very notion of what collapse means. It's rarely a full-stop ending, but more often a dramatic and sometimes violent reorganization. Think of the Western Roman Empire. Its slow fragmentation over centuries created a power vacuum that, unlike the swift transition after Ashur, led to what we traditionally call the Dark Ages in Europe. Centralized government, large-scale economy, and complex infrastructure crumbled, giving way to localized feudal systems. Knowledge was preserved, but in isolated monastic communities, not immediately integrated into new, vibrant state structures. The Roman collapse was a drawn-out unraveling, whereas the fall of Ashur was more like a sudden corporate takeover, where the new management kept the entire corporate structure and simply rebranded it. The key difference lies in the preparedness and proximity of the successors. The Germanic tribes who inherited Rome's territories did not have a pre-existing, sophisticated administrative system ready to go. The Babylonians and Medes, however, had been living in the shadow of the Assyrian behemoth for generations. They were already well versed in its methods and were poised to seize its tools the moment they fell. Now consider a collapse from the other side of the world, the classic Maya civilization. Around the 9th century of the Common Era, their magnificent city-states in Central America were abandoned, their grand pyramids reclaimed by the jungle. This was a collapse of a different character altogether. Unlike Ashur, which was conquered by a clear external force, the Maya decline appears to have been driven primarily by internal and environmental pressures, a complex cocktail of prolonged drought, intense warfare between city-states, and the overexploitation of their fragile tropical environment. There was no single, invading army to topple them, and crucially, no obvious, powerful neighbor to immediately step in and absorb their legacy. The knowledge of their writing system and their advanced calendrical science was largely lost, not because it was destroyed, but because the social and political order that sustained it simply dissolved. The population dispersed and the complex urban way of life vanished for centuries. Here, the contrast with Ashur is stark. The Maya collapse was a retreat from complexity, a devolution. The Assyrian collapse, by comparison, was an immediate transfer of complexity to new hands, ensuring that the intricate systems of law, administration, and trade not only survived but were enhanced. So, what are the common threads that run through these disparate historical unravelings? Scholars like Jared Diamond have pointed to a recurring checklist of culprits: environmental damage, climate change, hostile neighbors, fading trade partners, and a society's own failure to adapt to these challenges. Both Ashur and Rome grappled with the immense cost of overexpansion, the logistical nightmare of protecting vast, distant frontiers, and the constant drain on resources to fund the armies that enforced the peace. Both likely faced environmental strain, with deforestation and soil erosion undermining the agricultural base that fed their cities and troops. The Maya, in their own context, hit a similar ecological wall. The universal truth here is that empires are incredibly complex and energy-intensive systems. They are like giant engines that require a constant and ever-increasing supply of fuel in the form of grain, timber, metal, and human labor. When the cost of extracting that fuel becomes greater than the system can bear, or when the fuel sources themselves begin to fail, the engine seizes up. The specific trigger might be an invasion, a drought, or a civil war, but the underlying vulnerability is often this fundamental imbalance between the empire's ambitions and its resource base. Where histories truly diverge, however, is in the aftermath, the resilience and recovery phase. This is where Ashur's story becomes particularly instructive. The single most important factor in determining whether a collapse leads to a dark age or a renaissance seems to be the fate of its knowledge and administrative class. In the case of Ashur, as we've seen, the scribes, engineers, and bureaucrats were not slaughtered. They were assimilated. Their expertise was far too valuable to discard. The Persian Empire actively sought them out, offering them positions and patronage. This ensured a direct and continuous thread of institutional memory. Contrast this with the fall of the Qin dynasty in China, which was followed by a period of civil war before the consolidation of the Han. While the Han kept many Qin administrative structures, the transition was violent and disruptive. Or consider the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 before the Common Era, when a network of interconnected civilizations from Greece to Egypt fell apart in a cascade of invasions, migrations, and systems failure. In that event, the loss was so comprehensive that writing itself disappeared from the Greek world for centuries. The unique success of the post-Ashur transition was this remarkably efficient recycling of human capital, a pragmatic recognition that the true wealth of an empire is not in its treasuries but in the trained minds of its people. Another critical difference lies in the nature of the successor states. The empires that followed Ashur, the Neo-Babylonian, and especially the Achaemenid Persian, were, in a sense, its intellectual children. They had been observing, interacting with, and sometimes rebelling against the Assyrian system for generations. They knew its strengths and its weaknesses intimately. When they took power, they were not starting from scratch. They were conducting a hostile takeover with a detailed business plan for improvement. They knew which parts of the system to keep: the provincial administration, the road networks, the professional army, and which parts to discard, namely the policy of rule through sheer terror. This is very different from the nomadic groups that filled the power vacuum after the Han dynasty in China, or the Germanic tribes that moved into Roman territories. While these groups eventually adopted and adapted elements of the preceding culture, the process was much slower and more fraught with conflict. They had to learn the complexities of statecraft from a much lower baseline. The successors to Ashur were already graduates of the imperial school of hard knocks. They were ready to run the place on day one. What ultimate lessons about resilience can we draw from placing Ashur alongside its fallen peers? It suggests that the most catastrophic collapses are not necessarily those with the most dramatic military defeats, but those where the transmission of knowledge is severed. A society's ability to bounce back, or even to transform into something new and vigorous, is directly proportional to its ability to preserve and redeploy its intellectual and administrative tools. It also highlights that empires built on pure extraction and intimidation, like Ashur and arguably Rome, create a reservoir of resentment that makes their collapse more likely to be total and their legacy more likely to be vilified. Those that incorporate a degree of flexibility, tolerance, and shared interest, as the Persians attempted to do, lay a foundation for greater longevity. The comparison shows us that collapse is not a judgment on a civilization's inherent value, but a brutal Darwinian process that tests its adaptability. Ashur, for all its terrifying power, failed that final test of adaptability in its political form, but its cultural and institutional DNA was so robust that it passed seamlessly into new hosts, proving that the most enduring legacy is not an unbroken line of rulers, but an unbroken chain of ideas. Consider the sudden tremor that ran through the courts of Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant the moment the news arrived. The unthinkable had happened. The Assyrian giant was dead. For decades, these regions had lived under the long, intimidating shadow of Ashur, either as conquered provinces forced to pay heavy tribute or as nervous neighbors constantly looking over their shoulder. The immediate sensation must have been a dizzying mix of liberation and profound uncertainty. The old bully was gone, but the schoolyard was now full of ambitious new players, and the rules were being rewritten in real time. This was not a peaceful transition. It was a geopolitical earthquake, and the aftershocks rippled outwards, forcing every kingdom, from the Nile Delta to the highlands of Anatolia, to make a choice: adapt quickly or be left behind. The collapse of a single, dominant power didn't create a vacuum of activity. It unleashed a frenzy of it, as long-suppressed ambitions were suddenly given room to breathe and old strategies had to be torn up and replaced with new, more agile plans for survival and prosperity in a suddenly multipolar world. In the Levant, the city-states of Phoenicia experienced this new reality not as a threat, but as the opportunity of a lifetime. Cities like Tyre and Sidon had long been the reluctant bankers and shipwrights of the Assyrian Empire, their famed fleets and craft workshops often co-opted for imperial projects. With that pressure lifted, they exploded into a golden age of commercial expansion. The Phoenicians were the undisputed masters of the sea, and they now used their maritime prowess to weave a web of trade and colonization that stretched across the entire Mediterranean. They established powerful new colonies like Carthage in North Africa, which would eventually grow to rival Rome itself. These were not mere trading posts. They were independent daughter cities that replicated Phoenician culture, governance, and most importantly, their commercial acumen. This created a decentralized, resilient network. If conflict disrupted trade in the eastern Mediterranean, Carthage and other Western colonies could thrive independently, their economic power no longer tethered to the fate of a single land-based empire. The Phoenicians, in essence, used the power vacuum to build their own, maritime-centered empire of commerce, proving that in the New World Order, control of the sea lanes could be just as potent as control of the land. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, the Kingdom of Lydia seized the moment to transform itself from a regional power into a legendary source of wealth and innovation. With the Assyrian threat to their east eliminated, the Lydian kings, particularly the famed Croesus, turned their attention inward and to the Aegean coast. They consolidated control over Western Anatolia, and in a stroke of genius that would change the world, they are credited with inventing coinage. While the concept of standardized metal for exchange existed before, the Lydians perfected the use of stamped, certified coins made from a natural alloy of gold and silver called electrum. This was a revolutionary development in economic history. It dramatically simplified trade, provided a reliable state-backed store of value, and made the Lydian kingdom immensely wealthy and influential. Their capital, Sardis, became a bustling economic hub where the overland trade routes of Anatolia met the maritime networks of the Greek world. Lydia's story is a perfect example of how the post-Ashur environment didn't just allow old powers to grow, it created the conditions for groundbreaking innovations that would fundamentally reshape how human societies conducted business, fostering an economic fluidity that connected continents. For the kingdom of Judah in the southern Levant, the fall of Ashur was a deeply transformative spiritual and political event. For years, they had been a vassal state, caught between the competing empires of Assyria and Egypt. The sudden collapse of their northern oppressor was initially seen as a miraculous deliverance, a validation of their prophet's warnings and their God Yahweh's power. This period, often called the Deuteronomic Reform under King Josiah, saw a centralization of worship in Jerusalem and a fervent effort to purge foreign religious influences. It was a national and religious reawakening born from the trauma of Assyrian domination. However, this newfound independence was tragically short-lived. The rising Neo-Babylonian Empire, the new master of Mesopotamia, soon turned its attention to the region. The Babylonians besieged Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and carried a significant portion of the Jewish population into exile in what is known as the Babylonian captivity. This catastrophic event could have been the end of Judah as a distinct culture. Instead, it became the crucible in which modern Judaism was forged. In exile without their temple or homeland, the Jewish community was forced to adapt. They began to gather in synagogues for prayer and study, focusing on the text of their sacred scriptures. Their prophets, like the anonymous voice known as Second Isaiah, began to articulate a more universal vision of their God, not just as a tribal deity, but as the one true God of all creation, who could even anoint a pagan Persian king like Cyrus as his Messiah. This profound theological evolution, from a national religion to a more portable and universalist faith, was a direct response to the geopolitical shockwaves initiated by Ashur's fall. Even the ancient, formidable civilization of Egypt could not escape the ripple effects. The Egyptians had a long and bitter history with the Assyrians, who had actually sacked the great city of Thebes in 663 before the Common Era. The fall of Ashur was a relief, but it did not bring security. A new, even more powerful empire was rising in the east, Persia. When the Persian king Cambyses II invaded Egypt in 525 before the Common Era, the Egyptians were ready. They had learned a painful lesson from the Assyrian conquest. Historical accounts and archaeological evidence suggest that the Egyptian military actively reformed its tactics and equipment, adopting and adapting the very tools that had made the Assyrian army so formidable. They integrated more foreign mercenaries, particularly Greeks, who fought in the heavy hoplite style that was effective against Eastern armies. They likely studied Assyrian siegecraft to improve their own fortifications and defensive strategies. The famous Egyptian navy was also strengthened to contest control of the Mediterranean. While they were ultimately conquered by Persia, their resistance was far from feeble. They were fighting with a new hybrid military doctrine, a blend of traditional Egyptian methods and hard-won lessons from their previous defeats. This demonstrates how military knowledge, once a tool of oppression, could be reverse-engineered by its victims, creating a dynamic where tactics and technologies circulated and evolved ever faster, raising the stakes for every power in the region. Beneath these high-level political and military shifts, a deeper, quieter transformation was occurring through the constant movement of people. The Assyrian collapse triggered waves of migration, refugees fleeing war-torn areas, artisans seeking new patrons, and merchants chasing new markets. This human tide was a powerful agent of cultural blending. An Assyrian metalworker might settle in a Phoenician city, teaching local smiths how to work iron with greater skill, while simultaneously adopting Phoenician designs for his own work. Aramean scribes carrying their simple alphabetic script found employment from Egypt to Persia, making Aramaic the administrative language of the age and facilitating communication across countless cultures. This daily, person-to-person exchange is what created the truly interconnected ancient world. It wasn't just treaties between kings that linked these regions. It was the Aramaic contract signed by a merchant in Gaza, the Lydian coin used to buy grain in Egypt, and the hybrid pottery style found in a village in Anatolia that combined local forms with Assyrian decorative motifs. The fall of a centralized empire had, paradoxically, enabled a more organic, bottom-up form of globalization, where ideas, technologies, and artistic styles could cross borders not by imperial decree, but through the countless decisions of ordinary people seeking a better life. This intricate web of mutual influence, woven from both crisis and opportunity, proves that the most profound historical changes often occur not in the palaces of conquerors, but in the bustling ports, marketplaces, and workshops where different worlds continually collide and combine. But the story of what happened next wasn't just written on the battlefield. It was carved into stone and baked onto clay by the victors, who understood that controlling the past was the key to securing the future. In the wake of Ashur's fall, the new rulers of the ancient world launched a sophisticated campaign not just of conquest but of persuasion. They wielded propaganda as a tool of statecraft, carefully crafting narratives through grand inscriptions, monumental art, and official chronicles to frame the collapse of the old empire not as a chaotic defeat, but as a necessary and even righteous transformation. This wasn't merely about bragging. It was a deliberate project to shape historical memory, to legitimize their own rule in the eyes of a diverse and potentially skeptical population, and to create a sense of moral order out of the ashes of war. The Babylonian and Persian kings knew that to govern effectively, they had to win the battle for hearts and minds, convincing their new subjects that the change in power was not just a shift in masters, but a liberation and a return to justice. One of the most brilliant examples of this persuasive power is the Cyrus cylinder, a small, barrel-shaped clay object discovered in the ruins of Babylon. Inscribed after the Persian king Cyrus the Great took the city in 539 before the Common Era, this text is a masterpiece of political rhetoric. It doesn't present Cyrus as a foreign conqueror. Instead, it paints a vivid picture of a liberator. It accuses the last Babylonian king, Nabonidus, of impiety and of neglecting the worship of the supreme god Marduk. It claims that Marduk, angered by this sacrilege, scoured the nations for a righteous ruler and found Cyrus, taking him by the hand and calling him to bring order to Babylon. The cylinder then details Cyrus's virtuous acts, restoring deported peoples to their homelands, allowing them to rebuild their temples, and returning their confiscated cult statues. This was a narrative of restoration, not destruction, but the true genius lies in its subtle appropriation of Assyrian themes. The very idea of a king being chosen by a god to bring order was a core part of Assyrian royal ideology. Cyrus wasn't inventing a new story. He was skillfully retelling the old one, casting himself in the familiar role of the divinely appointed ruler, but with a crucial twist. His power was based on tolerance and piety, not terror and extraction. By using this established framework, his message resonated with audiences who are already conditioned to understand power in these terms, making his new, more inclusive model of kingship feel both legitimate and familiar. Beyond written decrees, the new rulers engaged in a powerful visual dialogue with the past, systematically erasing or repurposing the symbols of Assyrian authority. The mighty Lamassu, those colossal winged bulls that guarded Assyrian palace gates, were powerful symbols of a king's invincibility. The conquerors could have smashed them to dust as an act of vengeance. But in many cases, they chose a more subtle and psychologically potent approach. They left the statues standing but defaced them. They would carefully chisel away the face of the Assyrian king inscribed on the creature's body, effectively blinding the symbol and stripping it of its specific identity and power. This wasn't mindless vandalism, it was a calculated act of symbolic erasure. It demonstrated that the old guardian spirits were now powerless, their protective magic broken. At the same time, these new kings also engaged in appropriation. They would take captured Assyrian artifacts, exquisite carved ivories, fine metalwork, even the very foundation stones from Assyrian palaces, and incorporate them into their own buildings. By placing a looted Assyrian statue in the courtyard of a Babylonian temple, they were making a clear statement. The wealth and grandeur of the old empire now served its successors. This visual language of erasure and reuse physically demonstrated a transfer of power, showing that the new order was built literally upon the foundations of the old, but had subsumed and mastered it. The Assyrians themselves had been masters of a very different kind of propaganda, and the contrast between their methods and those of their successors is stark and revealing. Assyrian royal annals and palace reliefs were designed to inspire sheer, unadulterated terror. The walls of their palaces were covered with meticulously carved scenes of siege warfare, impalements, flayings, and the systematic looting of cities. Captions boasted of piles of severed heads, pyramids of corpses, and the enslavement of entire populations. The message was brutal and unambiguous: resistance is futile, and the price of defiance is annihilation. This was propaganda aimed at intimidating foreign ambassadors and domestic elites alike, reinforcing the absolute power of the king through the spectacle of violence. The Babylonian and Persian approach, however, marked a profound shift in tone. While they certainly celebrated their military victories, the emphasis moved away from graphic depictions of suffering and toward themes of peace, piety, and prosperous order. The Ishtar Gate of Babylon is a celebration of divine favor and civic splendor, not a chronicle of conquest. The reliefs at the Persian capital of Persepolis show long, orderly processions of delegates from across the empire bringing tribute, not scenes of battle. The new propaganda argued that the empire's legitimacy came from its ability to create stability and respect tradition, not from its capacity to inflict pain. This was a smarter, more sustainable strategy, aimed at building long-term loyalty rather than just short-term fear. Monumental architecture became the ultimate canvas for this new storytelling. When King Nebuchadnezzar II rebuilt Babylon, he wasn't just constructing a city, he was building a legend. The towering ziggurat, the lavish processional way, and the dazzling Ishtar Gate covered in glazed blue bricks and golden dragons were not merely functional. They were a physical manifestation of his claim to have restored Babylon to its mythical glory, positioning himself as the heir to a timeless Mesopotamian tradition. The scale and beauty of these projects were themselves a form of propaganda, broadcasting a message of wealth, power, and divine favor that anyone, regardless of language or literacy, could understand. Similarly, the Persian kings at Persepolis constructed a vast ceremonial complex that visually articulated their imperial ideology. The Apadana, or audience hall, was raised on a massive platform, forcing visitors to ascend to the king's level, a physical representation of his elevated status. The famous reliefs on its stairways depict representatives from every corner of the empire: Medes, Egyptians, Indians, Greeks, each in their distinctive national dress, bringing gifts to the king. This image presented the empire as a harmonious, united family of nations, voluntarily offering their loyalty to a benevolent Persian ruler. It was a vision of power based on inclusion and order, a direct rebuttal to the Assyrian model of domination and fear. The long-term impact of this ancient spin doctoring extends right into our modern history books. The narratives crafted by the Babylonian and Persian scribes have profoundly shaped historiography, influencing how we still view this period today. Our primary written sources for the fall of Assyria come from its enemies, the Babylonian chronicles and the biblical texts, which understandably portray the event as a deserved punishment for Assyrian arrogance and cruelty. For centuries, historians relied heavily on these accounts, which painted a picture of the Assyrians as one-dimensional villains. It is only with the advent of modern archaeology and the decipherment of Assyria's own records that we have begun to recover a more balanced view, one that acknowledges their sophistication as administrators, scholars, and engineers alongside their renowned brutality. Understanding this ancient framing is therefore not just an academic exercise. It is a crucial tool for decoding our sources. It teaches us to read between the lines of every royal inscription, to ask not just what happened, but why this particular story is being told in this particular way. It reminds us that history is never a simple record of facts, but a collection of stories, each with its own purpose, its own biases, and its own power to shape reality for generations to come. When the last embers cooled in the ruins of Nineveh, it might have seemed like the story was over, but in reality, the most significant chapter was just beginning, a chapter whose final lines would be written not in Mesopotamia, but in the forums of Rome and the academies of Athens. This was not a conclusion, it was a great dispersal, a seeding of ideas across continents and centuries. The fall of Ashur acted as a crucial historical catalyst, forcing the accumulated knowledge of the ancient Near East out of its centralized vaults and into a fertile, circulating system of exchange. The administrative genius, military doctrines, and cosmological concepts honed by the Assyrians did not vanish. They embarked on a long, slow migration westward, filtered first through the sophisticated prism of the Persian Empire, and then magnified by the conquests of Alexander the Great, ultimately providing the essential raw materials for the intellectual and political architecture of the classical world. Without this turbulent transfer, the very shape of Western civilization, its science, its laws, its understanding of empire would look profoundly different, reminding us that the most pivotal moments in history are often not the births of new ideas, but the moments those ideas are set free to travel. One of the most direct and demonstrable transmissions was in the realm of science, particularly astronomy. The scholarly priests of Babylon, who had inherited and expanded the vast observational archives of their Assyrian predecessors, achieved a level of predictive accuracy that bordered on the mystical. They could plot the complex cycles of Venus and predict lunar eclipses with remarkable precision, not through guesswork, but through centuries of meticulously recorded data etched into cuneiform tablets. This was a science of patterns, a belief that the cosmos operated according to decipherable mathematical laws. When Alexander the Great swept through the Persian Empire, he brought Greek scholars in his wake who were astounded by this ancient knowledge. Figures like Berosus, a Babylonian priest, established a school on the Greek island of Kos, directly translating and teaching Mesopotamian astronomy to Greek students. This encounter was transformative. The Greek mind, with its passion for abstract geometry and philosophical first principles, met the empirical, data-driven tradition of Mesopotamia. The Greek astronomer Hipparchus, working in the 2nd century before the Common Era, is often credited with discovering the precession of the equinoxes, but his groundbreaking work was almost certainly built upon those long Babylonian star catalogues. This fusion of Greek theory and Mesopotamian data created the foundation for the Ptolemaic system that would dominate Western thought for 1500 years, a direct lineage connecting the observatories of Babylon to the revolution of Copernicus. The concept of empire itself, the very model of organizing vast territories under a single ruler, is perhaps the most enduring political legacy of this era. The Assyrians were the first to demonstrate the terrifying efficiency of a centrally administered, militarized state, but it was the Persians who refined this model into a more sustainable and transferable blueprint. Their system of satrapies, royal roads, and a unifying imperial ideology was a masterclass in large-scale governance. When the young Alexander of Macedon toppled the Persian king Darius III, he did not dismantle this system, he absorbed it. He appointed his own generals as satraps, he walked the royal roads, and he began to adopt the ceremonial trappings of a Persian monarch, much to the dismay of his Macedonian companions. Alexander's brief, dazzling empire was, in its administrative skeleton, a Hellenized version of the Persian state, which was itself an evolution of the Assyrian prototype. This model did not die with Alexander. His successors, the Diadochi, who carved up his empire, continued to operate within this framework. Later, when the Romans began to expand beyond Italy, they encountered the Hellenistic kingdoms of the East, themselves inheritors of this long chain of imperial thought. The Roman solution to governing diverse peoples, the provincial system, the network of roads for legions and trade, the complex legal distinctions between citizens and subjects, all bear the unmistakable imprint of an ancient idea, adapted and hardened by Roman pragmatism. The Roman ambition for a single, unified orbis terrarum, or world, echoes the Persian conception of a universal empire, a vision first made tangible by the Assyrians. This legacy is also strikingly visible in the silent language of power and art, in the imperial iconography that adorned public spaces for millennia. The majestic ruins of Persepolis stand as a testament to this visual inheritance. The great Lamassu, the winged human-headed bulls that guarded the gateways, are direct descendants of the colossal guardians from Assyrian palaces like Khorsabad. While the Persian versions are often more serene and stylized, their symbolic function is identical: to project an aura of superhuman power and protection at the threshold of the king's domain. When Roman generals returned from their campaigns in the East, they brought back not only spoils but artistic ideas. The concept of triumphal processions, depicting conquered peoples and their gifts in detailed reliefs, has strong precursors in the art of both Assyria and Persia. The very idea of using public art as a tool of political propaganda to narrate the glory of the state to its citizens was a Near Eastern innovation that the Romans perfected. Even the grand urban planning of imperial Rome, with its axial forums, its monumental temples, and its emphasis on processional avenues, owes a conceptual debt to the model of cities like Babylon and Persepolis, where architecture was designed to overwhelm the visitor and reinforce the cosmic order of the king's rule. This visual vocabulary of power, born in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, became a universal language spoken by empires for centuries to come. Perhaps the most profound, though often least visible, consequences were in the realm of religious and philosophical thought. The great ideological innovation of the Persian Empire was Zoroastrianism, with its cosmic dualism of a supreme god of light, Ahura Mazda, locked in a struggle with a destructive spirit of falsehood. This was a radical departure from the capricious gods of older pantheons, introducing a moral and ethical framework to the universe itself. As this Persian ideology spread, it interacted with the traditions of subject peoples, including the Jews living in exile in Babylon. This encounter was transformative for Jewish theology. Pre-exilic Judaism was largely focused on a national god, Yahweh, who was primarily concerned with the fate of Israel. The experience of the exile and exposure to Zoroastrian ideas catalyzed a shift toward a more universal and transcendent vision. In the later parts of the Hebrew Bible, particularly in the works of the post-exilic prophets and the development of apocalyptic literature, we see the emergence of concepts that bear a striking resemblance to Zoroastrian thought. A more developed Satan figure as an adversarial force, a final judgment, a clear heaven and hell, and the resurrection of the dead. These were not simple copies but creative adaptations within the Jewish tradition. This refined and universalized Jewish theology then became the bedrock for Christianity, which would itself go on to become a foundational pillar of Western civilization. The theological currents that flowed from the Persian world, a world remade by the fall of Ashur, thus indirectly shaped one of the most significant religious transformations in human history. The role of diaspora communities in this grand transmission of knowledge cannot be overstated. The collapse of the Assyrian state did not mean the Assyrian people vanished, it meant they were scattered. These displaced communities, scribes, artisans, merchants, and priests became living libraries, carrying their specialized knowledge with them as they integrated into new societies across the Near East. Aramaic, the Lingua Franca of the Assyrian administrative apparatus, became the common tongue of trade and diplomacy from Egypt to India, ensuring that a legal contract written in Damascus could be understood in Persepolis. This created a vast, interconnected zone of communication that facilitated the flow of not just goods but ideas. Greek philosophers and scientists, from Thales to Pythagoras, lived and traveled in a world that was already deeply shaped by Eastern wisdom. The very concept that the chaotic universe could be reduced to a single underlying principle, or arche, which is the starting point of Greek philosophy, may have been inspired by exposure to the monistic tendencies in Zoroastrianism or the orderly mathematical principles observed in Babylonian astronomy. The intellectual ferment of the Axial Age, that remarkable period when revolutionary thinking emerged simultaneously in China, India, and the Mediterranean, was not a series of isolated miracles. In the West, it was fueled by this unprecedented cross-pollination between the logical, questioning spirit of the Greeks and the ancient, empirical wisdom of the East, a dialogue made possible by the interconnected world that emerged from Assyria's ashes. Taking this long view, spanning over 1,000 years from the fall of Nineveh to the rise of Rome, teaches us a humbling and essential lesson about the nature of human progress. Civilization does not advance in a straight line with one culture neatly replacing the last. Instead, it operates more like a relay race where the baton of knowledge, technology, and governance is passed from one runner to the next, sometimes smoothly, sometimes fumbled, but always moving forward. The fall of Ashur was one of those critical hand-off points. It was a moment of violent, disruptive change that, paradoxically, ensured the survival and enhancement of its greatest achievements. The Assyrian model of empire was too brittle to last, but its core components were too valuable to lose. By being broken apart, its pieces were made available for others to pick up, refine, and reassemble into new, more durable forms. This interconnectedness forces us to abandon any simplistic notion of a pure, Western civilization born solely in Greece. Our world is the product of a deep and ancient dialogue, a conversation across millennia that began on the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. The legacy of Ashur is a powerful reminder that no civilization is an island. We are all the heirs of a shared and deeply entangled human past, built layer upon layer by the successes, failures, and unexpected renewals of those who came before us. Look at our world today, a landscape of rapid technological change, simmering geopolitical rivalries, and the looming, interconnected threats of climate instability and economic fragility. It can feel uniquely chaotic, as if we are living through a period of unprecedented uncertainty. But the ghost of ancient Ashur whispers to us across the centuries that this is not the first time human civilization has stood at such a crossroads. The story of its fall and the astonishing rebirth that followed is far more than a dusty historical anecdote. It is a masterclass in navigating systemic collapse, offering a powerful and deeply relevant playbook for our own time. The central transformative lesson is this: what we perceive as an ending can be the most potent catalyst for a necessary and profound new beginning. The Assyrian Empire, for all its terrifying power, had become rigid, overextended, and brittle, a system so focused on domination that it lost the capacity for adaptation. Its collapse was not a final defeat, but a brutal, necessary release of energy that allowed for a recalibration, forcing innovation, diversification, and the creation of more resilient and inclusive models of power. In our modern context, this ancient narrative reframes our greatest challenges not as existential threats to be merely survived, but as potential catalysts for the kind of transformative renewal our global systems may desperately need. Consider the striking parallel between the Assyrian model of hyper-centralized control and the vulnerabilities of our own modern, interconnected world. The Assyrian economy and military were overwhelmingly dependent on a single, top-down command structure and the constant extraction of resources from a vast empire. When the royal court in Nineveh was struck, the entire system seized up. Today, we see a similar fragility in our just-in-time global supply chains. A pandemic disrupts shipping and suddenly store shelves go empty. A war in one breadbasket region triggers a global food crisis. A cyber attack on a single critical piece of infrastructure can threaten the stability of a nation. The Assyrian experience teaches us that systems optimized purely for maximum efficiency and central control are inherently vulnerable to single points of failure. The antidote, as demonstrated by the vibrant post-Ashur world, is deliberate diversification and the cultivation of redundancy. The Phoenicians didn't just rely on one trade route. They built a decentralized network of colonies across the entire Mediterranean. Our modern lesson is clear. Building resilience means fostering multiple sources for essential goods, investing in local production capabilities, and creating robust alternative systems for energy, information, and food that can withstand a shock in any one part of the globe. It is about moving from a model of brittle efficiency to one of antifragile adaptability. This principle extends powerfully into the realm of governance and social cohesion. The Assyrians ruled through a policy of forced assimilation and brutal suppression of cultural identity, a strategy that bred deep-seated resentment and guaranteed that conquered peoples would rebel the moment the empire showed weakness. The Persian successors, learning from this catastrophic mistake, pioneered a radically different approach based on what we would now call multiculturalism and subsidiarity. By allowing local populations to maintain their own laws, customs, and religions within the broader imperial framework, they traded raw control for genuine loyalty. They created stability through inclusion, not oppression. The modern application of this ancient wisdom is urgent and profound. In an era of rising nationalism, cultural polarization, and mass migration, the Assyrian model of top-down cultural imposition is a proven recipe for long-term failure. The Persian alternative offers a timeless lesson in the strength that comes from embracing diversity, granting local communities a meaningful degree of autonomy, and building a shared identity based on common values and mutual benefit rather than on enforced uniformity. This is not merely a moral imperative, it is, as history demonstrates, a fundamental strategic one for any society that hopes to endure. Perhaps the most critical modern application lies in our approach to preserving and transmitting knowledge. The Assyrians, in their own way, understood its value, amassing the great library of Ashurbanipal, but they centralized it, making it a single, vulnerable treasure. Its survival was a near miracle, dependent on the fired clay of its tablets, and the fact that conquerors saw value in looting its contents rather than obliterating them entirely. Today, our collective knowledge is facing a different kind of threat, not from a single invading army, but from digital decay, the ephemeral nature of online platforms, and the potential for targeted information blackouts. The diaspora of Assyrian scribes who carried their expertise into new lands is a powerful metaphor for the need to decentralize and democratize knowledge in our digital age. It argues for open access archives, for backing up crucial data in multiple, distributed locations, and for ensuring that vital skills, from traditional crafts to advanced programming, are widely taught and not hoarded by a tiny elite. In an age of disinformation, the role of the modern scribe, the librarian, the archivist, the fact-checker, the educator, becomes as crucial as that of any soldier or politician, for they are the guardians of the factual record upon which any functioning society depends. The environmental pressures that likely contributed to Ashur's decline also echo with chilling familiarity today. Evidence suggests that centuries of intensive agriculture and deforestation to support the empire's colossal cities and armies may have degraded the very land that fed it, making it more vulnerable to climate shifts. This is a stark warning against pushing our planetary systems to their breaking point for short-term gain. The Persian response, with their investment in sustainable technologies like the Qanat system that unlocked new agricultural land without overburdening old resources, points the way forward. It is a lesson in working with our environment, in investing in green infrastructure, and in thinking in terms of long-term regeneration rather than short-term extraction. The fall of Ashur reminds us that no civilization, no matter how advanced its military or sophisticated its bureaucracy, is immune to the consequences of ecological neglect. Our current climate crisis is the ultimate test of this principle, demanding a shift in perspective from conquering nature to cooperating with its limits and cycles. Finally, the story of Ashur's transformation is ultimately a story about human agency and the kind of leadership required in times of profound transition. The leaders who shaped the New World Order, figures like Cyrus the Great, were not simply lucky opportunists. They were students of history who possessed the wisdom to learn from the failures of their predecessors. They saw that the old ways of ruling through fear and sheer force were unsustainable, and they had the courage to innovate, to embrace tolerance, and to build systems designed for longevity rather than mere conquest. In our own era of global polycrises, we are in desperate need of this same brand of enlightened, long-term leadership. We need leaders who are not just fighting the last war, but who are actively studying the patterns of history, who understand the value of diplomacy over ultimatums, and who prioritize building resilient, inclusive institutions that can weather the storms of change. The journey from the smoldering ruins of Nineveh to the cosmopolitan tolerance of Persepolis proves that collapse does not have to be our destiny. It can be, if we have the wisdom to learn its lessons and the courage to act upon them, the difficult but necessary birth of something wiser, more connected, and more humane. The choice is not between rise and fall, but between brittle resistance to change and the resilient embrace of transformation. So as our journey through this remarkable transformation draws to a close, let's pause for a moment and consider the full weight of what we've uncovered. We began with a scene of apparent catastrophe, the mighty city of Ashur engulfed in flames, its grand palaces toppled, its imperial banners trampled into the dust. From our modern perspective, conditioned by countless stories of rise and fall, this looked like the definitive end of a civilization. But as we've walked through the evidence together, from the archaeologist's trowel to the translated cuneiform tablet, a completely different picture has emerged. What appeared as a defeat was in reality a profound and necessary metamorphosis. The rigid, monolithic structure of the Assyrian Empire, for all its terrifying power, had reached its natural limit. It had become too centralized, too dependent on brute force, too brittle to adapt to the changing world it had helped create. Its collapse wasn't a failure of civilization, but a failure of a particular model of power, and in that failure lay the seeds of something more resilient, more connected, and ultimately more humane. The true story isn't one of an ending, but of a spectacular dispersal where the seeds of Assyrian genius, their laws, their administrative systems, their technologies, were carried on the winds of change to take root in fertile new soil. This perspective challenges one of our most deep-seated assumptions about history and about our own lives, the fear of collapse. We're taught to see breakdown as synonymous with failure, to view the end of an era as a tragedy. But the centuries that followed the fall of Ashur present us with a powerful counter-narrative. They show us that the most profound renewals often require the breaking of old vessels. Think of the scribes who carried the contents of Ashurbanipal's library to new centers of learning, ensuring that knowledge wouldn't be lost but would instead fuel Babylonian astronomy and, eventually, Greek science. Consider the artisans whose skills, once dedicated solely to glorifying Assyrian kings, now enriched the artistic tapestry of an entire region, leading to the magnificent synthesis we see at Persepolis. Envision the merchants who, freed from Assyrian monopolies, wove a more complex and resilient web of trade from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. In every case, the end of a centralized, controlling power didn't lead to a dark age. It unleashed a wave of creativity, collaboration, and innovation. The energy that had been trapped within the rigid confines of the empire was suddenly released, flowing into new channels and empowering a much broader segment of society to participate in the building of a new world. The single most crucial lesson here is about the nature of resilience itself. The Assyrian Empire was strong in the way a massive stone wall is strong, imposing, and seemingly unbreakable, but vulnerable to a single, well-placed shock. The system that emerged after its fall, however, was strong in the way a living forest is strong, diverse, interconnected, and able to regenerate after a fire. The Persian policy of tolerating local customs and religions, a direct response to the failures of Assyrian oppression, created a stability that didn't rely on constant military terror. The diversification of trade routes meant that the failure of one pathway wouldn't cripple the entire economy. The sharing of technologies like the Qanat system allowed human settlement to flourish in new environments, reducing pressure on overexploited heartlands. This is a timeless blueprint for building systems that can endure. Whether we're thinking about our own personal lives, our communities, or our global civilization, the principle holds true. Resilience isn't about building higher walls, but about creating more and better connections. It's not about resisting all change, but about developing the capacity to adapt, to learn, and to transform when change becomes inevitable. This brings us to the most personal and immediate application of this ancient story. Each of us faces our own versions of collapse: the loss of a job, the end of a relationship, a personal crisis that shatters our sense of normalcy. In those moments, it's natural to see only the ruin, to grieve for what has been lost. But the history of Ashur's transformation invites us to adopt a more courageous and hopeful perspective. It asks us to look for the seeds of renewal hidden within the crisis. What old, rigid ways of thinking or being have been broken open, allowing new possibilities to emerge? What skills and knowledge can we carry forward from the old empire of our past into a new chapter? The diaspora of Assyrian scribes teaches us that our most valuable assets are often portable: our education, our experience, our capacity to learn and adapt. The rise of leaders like Cyrus shows us that the most profound transformations are often led by those who have the wisdom to learn from the mistakes of the past and the vision to imagine a more inclusive and sustainable future. Your personal fall of Ashur doesn't have to be an ending. It can be the painful but necessary clearing of ground, making space for a new world order in your own life, built on the wisdom you've gathered and the resilience you've cultivated. As we step back from the ancient world and return to our own, the connections feel startlingly vivid. Our globalized economy, for all its wonders, exhibits some of the same brittleness as the Assyrian system, over-reliant on complex, centralized supply chains that can snap under pressure. Our political landscapes are often dominated by the same old models of domination and exclusion that ultimately doomed Assyria, and we face an environmental challenge that echoes the resource depletion and ecological strain that likely contributed to their decline. But we also hold the same keys to renewal that they discovered. We have the capacity to build more decentralized, resilient networks. We can choose leaders who prioritize wisdom and inclusion over brute force. We can invest in the technologies and policies that regenerate our environment rather than deplete it. The past isn't just a collection of interesting stories, it's a repository of profound and practical wisdom. The journey from the ashes of Nineveh to the pillars of Persepolis proves that humanity has faced existential transitions before and has not only survived but thrived, often by building something wiser and more beautiful from the pieces of the old world. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal and misunderstood moments. If this story has reshaped how you see endings and beginnings, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What personal or historical falls have you seen lead to unexpected renewal? For more journeys into the mysteries of our past and the lessons they hold for our future, be sure to subscribe. The story of human civilization is an endless tapestry of collapse and rebirth, and we've only just begun to explore its patterns. Remember, the next time you witness an ending, whether in the news or in your own life, look closer. You might just be witnessing the first difficult birth pangs of a new world struggling to be born. From the ashes of the old, always and forever, new worlds emerge. And so we arrive at the final and perhaps most profound lesson that the dust of Ashur has to teach us. We've traced the incredible journey from a city in flames to the dawn of a more connected world, but this story is about so much more than just one empire. It's a powerful reminder that history itself doesn't move in a straight line of simple victories and defeats. Instead, it pulses with a deeper, more ancient rhythm, a cyclical dance of rise, fall, and rebirth that has defined human civilization from its very beginnings. The collapse of Ashur wasn't a full stop at the end of a sentence. It was a dramatic, necessary turn in this eternal cycle. The old structure, for all its power, had become rigid and unsustainable, a walled garden that could no longer contain the life it had nurtured. Its breaking apart was a painful but essential process, one that scattered the seeds of its own genius, its laws, its technologies, its administrative blueprints, allowing them to take root in new and more fertile soil. What we so often label as an ending is, from this wider perspective, often just the difficult and messy beginning of a new chapter, a necessary clearing of the ground for something different and often something better to grow. This cyclical view of history invites us to completely reframe how we see the challenges and transformations in our own world today. When we witness the decline of old institutions, the fracturing of long-standing alliances, or the upheaval in global markets, our instinct is often to panic, to see it as a slide into chaos. But the ghost of Ashur whispers a different narrative. It suggests that these moments of breakdown are not aberrations. They are part of a recurring pattern of renewal. The old system, like the Assyrian Empire, may have become too centralized, too brittle, or too unjust to continue. Its failure creates the space and the urgency for new ideas to emerge, for more resilient networks to form, and for long-suppressed voices to finally be heard. This isn't to glorify collapse, which is always accompanied by real human suffering, but to recognize its potential as a catalyst. It forces adaptation. It breaks monopolies on power and knowledge. It compels us to innovate, to collaborate, and to imagine different ways of organizing our world. Just as the Persian Empire learned from Assyria's fatal flaws to build a more tolerant and durable state, our own periods of crisis contain the raw materials and the hard-won lessons for building a more enlightened future. Carrying this insight forward can fundamentally change our personal and collective approach to the future. Instead of fearing change, we can learn to meet it with a sense of hopeful curiosity. Instead of clinging desperately to the way things are, we can develop the resilience to navigate the transition to what they might become. Think about the scribes who preserved Assyrian knowledge not by defending a burning library, but by carrying their clay tablets into new lands. Their legacy teaches us that our most valuable assets in times of transition are not our fixed positions or rigid beliefs, but our portable skills, our capacity to learn, and our willingness to adapt. On a societal level, this means investing not just in protecting the status quo, but in fostering the conditions for renewal, decentralizing our systems, preserving and openly sharing knowledge, and cultivating the kind of wise, forward-thinking leadership that a figure like Cyrus the Great exemplified, leadership that builds bridges rather than walls. The goal is not to prevent all change, which is impossible, but to build communities and systems that are agile enough to bend with the storms of history without breaking. Ultimately, the fall of Ashur and the birth of the world that followed is a testament to the incredible, enduring power of the human spirit. It is a story of resilience not just in the sense of survival, but in the more profound sense of regeneration. The people of that era, the displaced artisans, the pragmatic merchants, the scholarly scribes did not give up in the face of imperial collapse. They rolled up their sleeves and got to work, blending old traditions with new, forging new connections across ancient divides, and laying the foundations for centuries of future progress. Their story is a powerful antidote to the despair and cynicism that so often accompanies modern headlines. It reminds us that humanity has faced seemingly insurmountable challenges before and has consistently found a way through, not by going back, but by moving forward with creativity and courage. Our own global community, with all its daunting problems, is also brimming with this same latent potential. The seeds of the next world order are already among us, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. Thank you for joining me on this deep exploration of one of history's most transformative episodes. My greatest hope is that this journey has done more than just fill in a few gaps in the historical record. I hope it has offered you a new lens through which to view our own time, a lens of possibility. May the tale of Ashur's undefeat inspire you to look for the hidden opportunities within the challenges you face, to value resilience over rigidity, and to carry forward the timeless truth that from the ashes of the old, through the courage and creativity of people just like us,